Just as people do in real life, people in fiction talk to each other. And like real people, fictional characters have all sorts of reasons for talking to each other: to convey information, to persuade, to dissuade, to inspire, to manipulate, to tell the truth, to lie, to seduce, to enrage, to comfort, to amuse. But as with everything else in fiction, it isn't enough just to reproduce the way that real people talk. In my first lecture about character, I talked about how fictional people are often more memorable than real people because they are less complicated and more vivid. By the same token, dialogue in fiction can be more vivid and memorable than real speech, and for many of the same reasons that characters are more vivid than real people. In real life, speech and conversation can be rambling, ungrammatical, incoherent, ambiguous, repetitive, inconclusive, and dull. Fiction writers often mimic these effects to make characters sound more lifelike, but in the end, fictional speech can only suggest real speech, not reproduce it. If you've ever read a transcript of a real conversation, you'll have noticed that it didn't read anything like the speech we see in fiction. If you compare the speech of the real conspirators in the Watergate tapes, for example, with the conspirators in a Shakespeare history play like Julius Caesar, you'll find that Shakespeare's characters sound much more interesting and complex than Richard Nixon's staff. If people in fiction talked the way people do in real life, nobody would read it or believe it. Instead, fictional speech is more focused and coherent than real speech, just as fictional characters are more immediately comprehensible than real people. Even if fictional speech is ungrammatical and rambling, it still has to be ungrammatical and rambling in an interesting and purposeful way. I want to emphasize that second word, purposeful. In real life, sometimes we talk just to pass the time, or because we're nervous, or just to keep from being bored or rude. But in fiction, dialogue has to have a purpose, usually to evoke character, to advance the plot, or to provide exposition. Sometimes it does all three at once. This does not mean that dialogue is purely utilitarian or that it can't be entertaining for its own sake. And the fact that dialogue is purposeful doesn't require that characters always say what they mean. Some of the best dialogue, especially the dialogue that evokes character or the relationship between two characters, can be wonderfully oblique. Sometimes what a character isn't saying is more meaningful than what he or she is saying. I'll talk about that in the next lecture. Meanwhile, in this first lecture about dialogue, I want to talk first, very briefly, about the mechanics of writing dialogue. Then I want to talk about some basic techniques for using dialogue tags, for mixing speech and action, speech and exposition, and so on. Along the way, as painlessly as possible, I'm going to sneak in some actual grammar and punctuation. It's been my experience that even very good writers are sometimes unclear on the actual rules for writing dialogue. Unless you're writing some sort of postmodernist narrative where you're trying to call the reader's attention to the mechanics of the text, you want dialogue to be seamlessly integrated into the rest of the text, and that's more easily accomplished if you have mastered the rules and stick to them. If you glance at a page of fiction from a slight distance, close enough to see the paragraphs but too far away to read the words, it's impossible to tell if the text you're looking at is exposition or action or character description. From a distance, these different sorts of passages all look the same. Action and exposition are differentiated from each other only through context and by internal cues in the text itself. But even from across the room, you can identify a passage of dialogue by the choppy paragraph breaks, and, if you look closer, by the use of quotation marks and some special rules of punctuation. These special rules for dialogue serve two fundamental purposes: to separate direct quotations from the rest of the narrative, and to make it clear for the reader just who is speaking at any given time. The vast majority of fiction published since the 18th century has followed these rules with some variations. But from time to time, you'll come across some very good writers and some very good books where dialogue is punctuated in a non-standard way. In some books, each line of dialogue is marked with a dash at the beginning of each line instead of by quotation marks. Sometimes dialogue doesn't use quotation marks at all. Instead, it is set off from the rest of the narrative only by a paragraph break. And sometimes the dialogue isn't even set off by paragraphing. Instead, it's buried right in the middle of a passage, in which case you have to guess that it's dialogue from the context. As I say, there are some very good writers who have written dialogue in an unconventional way. There are long sections of dialogue in William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, for example, that don't use quotation marks. And The Sound and the Fury is one of the greatest American novels ever written. Another great writer who tends not to use quotation marks is Cormac McCarthy, the author of Blood Meridian and The Road. But great writers don't always make good role models. And on the whole, and with very few exceptions, writing dialogue without quotation marks or paragraph breaks is usually pretentious and often annoying. Think of it in terms of a cost-benefit analysis and ask yourself the following question. Is what you're gaining by not using standard punctuation for dialogue worth the extra effort you're making for the reader? On the one hand, in the case of The Sound and the Fury, the lack of quotation marks helps evoke the mental disability of the character Benji in the passages that are told from his point of view. On the other hand, even though I yield to no one in my admiration of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, I don't really think that the book would have been diminished if he'd used quotation marks. Most of what you need to know about the mechanics of writing dialogue can be summed up in a few rules. For examples of all these, pick up the nearest work of fiction you have to hand, or at least the nearest one that isn't written by William Faulkner or Cormac McCarthy. Find a few pages that are made up mostly of dialogue. You should be able to find most of the kinds of sentences I'm about to describe. The first rule is that all direct quotations, namely the exact words of a character, should be set apart from the rest of the text by quotation marks. The second rule is that every time a new character speaks or the speaker changes, his or her first line of dialogue should be set apart with a paragraph break. Also, the very beginning of a direct quotation should always begin with a capital letter. Now remember that I said that the rules of punctuation serve two purposes: to set dialogue apart from the rest of the narrative and to identify who is speaking at any given time. The first purpose is served by quotation marks and the paragraph breaks. The second purpose is served by identifying each speaker with something called a dialogue tag. In its most basic form, a dialogue tag is simply the name of the character or a pronoun standing in for the name, plus some variation on the verb said. He said, she said, Bob exclaimed, Elaine whispered, and so on. The rules of punctuating dialogue tags get a little tricky, but I'll lay them out quickly. The first rule is that the dialogue tag is not part of the actual quotation, so it should never be included within the quotation marks. But sometimes a dialogue tag comes in the middle of the quoted sentence. And when that happens, the first half of the quotation is set off by a comma and a quotation mark. The dialogue tag is followed with a comma, and the second half of the sentence begins with a quotation mark and a lowercase letter. However, if a dialogue tag appears between two complete sentences, then the dialogue tag ends with a period and the second sentence starts with a capital letter. That was quick, and I hope relatively painless. If any of it is confusing, any good grammar guide will explain the rules of punctuating dialogue in more detail than I can here. An even better way to learn them is simply to model what you do after what your favorite writer does, assuming your favorite writer isn't Cormac McCarthy. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about when to use dialogue tags, what sort of dialogue tags you should use, and how to mix dialogue with action and exposition. Unlike the rules of punctuation I just talked about, these are just tips, not rules. None of what I'm about to say is set in stone or is absolute. Other writers or writing teachers might disagree with them, and there are always exceptions and complications. These represent the rules of thumb that I use when I'm writing dialogue, and I think they represent more or less standard practice for most modern fiction writers. The first rule of thumb is that dialogue tags are necessary for three reasons. 1, to introduce a character who is speaking for the first time. 2, to identify the speakers when 2 or more people are speaking. Or 3, to get across necessary information or a bit of context that isn't clear from the dialogue itself. Let's take these 3 reasons one at a time, starting with introducing a character with a dialogue tag. You use a dialogue tag when you're introducing a character for the first time or when you're returning to a character at the beginning of a new chapter or scene. This is the most self-evident use of a dialogue tag. You want to tell the reader who's speaking. But even in this case, there can be exceptions. Say, for example, you open a scene with a single character walking alone into a setting, a woman coming ashore on a desert island after a shipwreck, say. You might write a paragraph or two about her struggling through the surf and struggling onto the beach. Given that she's the only person in sight, the first thing she says, "Is anybody here?" for example, or "Thank God I'm alive," would not necessarily need a dialogue tag because she's the only person present. Another instance when you might not need a dialogue tag at the very beginning of a scene would be if you were trying for a dramatic effect, like this. "Look out!" The detective turned just in time to see a large guy behind him swinging a baseball bat in his direction. That's a little crude, but you get the idea. The intent of this opening gambit is to immerse the reader right away in a dangerous and suspenseful situation. As a result, you don't need to know immediately who yelled "Look out," though this kind of opening sets up the expectation that the speaker will soon be identified. So perhaps this isn't so much an example of a dialogue without a tag as it is an example of dialogue with a deferred tag. Let's move to the second reason for deploying dialogue tags, which is to use them when you're writing a scene that has two or more speakers in it. The usual practice in this case is to identify each speaker with his or her first line of dialogue. Again, however, there can be exceptions. And if you've got more than two speakers in a scene, then you're going to have to use more dialogue tags just to keep them straight. Simply identifying the speaker or keeping several speakers straight are the most mechanical uses of dialogue tags. But now we come to the third reason for using dialogue tags, namely to provide some context or nuance that isn't conveyed by the dialogue itself, or to clear up an ambiguity. This use requires more judgment and skill, but it is just as essential. Let's take a very simple example. "I love you," she said. In most cases, the context for this simple but emotional statement is likely to be clear from whatever comes before or after it in the narrative. But it is easy to imagine a number of different ways that statement could be said by the speaker or heard by the character at whom it's directed, not to mention a number of ways it could be understood by the reader. Assuming you don't want the declaration to be ambiguous, there are simple ways of using the dialogue tag to make the statement clear. For example, "I love you," she laughed. "I love you," she sobbed. "I love you," she said casually. Or, instead of altering the dialogue tag, you could italicize one of the words in the dialogue itself to show the speaker's emphasis. Each one of the following versions is subtly different from the others. "I love you," she said. "I love you," she said. "I love you," she said. These examples should make clear that how and when you use a dialogue tag and what sort of dialogue tag you use depends almost entirely on the context of the scene. A little bit later in this lecture, I'll explore that idea in more detail. But first, having talked about when dialogue tags are necessary, let's talk about when they're not. My next rule of thumb about dialogue tags is that you should use them sparingly and that you should keep them as simple as possible. How you define sparingly varies from writer to writer, from story to story, and even from scene to scene within a story. But on the whole, the more you can rely on the actual speech of the characters to relay information or convey emotion, the better. In fact, on the whole, you should only use dialogue tags when it would otherwise be impossible to tell who is speaking, or, as I was just saying, when the context needs clarification. But when I say use dialogue tags sparingly, I don't mean too sparingly. On the one hand, you don't want to be obtrusive and redundant, hammering the reader with superfluous he says or she says or he sobbed or she whispered. But on the other hand, you don't want the reader to get confused. You want to strike a balance between two goals. On the one hand, you want the character's actual words to carry the weight of the conversation as much as possible. On the other hand, you don't want the reader to lose track of who's saying what. If you have a conversation between two characters that goes on for less than a page, you can probably get away with identifying the speakers at the beginning and then not mentioning them again. Here's an example. "Are you going to Miriam's party?" Mary asked. I don't know, said Glenn. I haven't made up my mind. Oh, for heaven's sake, are you still mad at her? I guess, a little. You're being silly. Get over it. In this case, it's easy not to use too many dialogue tags for two reasons. One is that it is a short exchange. The other is that it's reasonably clear from what the characters are saying just who is speaking at every moment, because one character, Mary, is taking the opposite position from the other character, Glenn. But even if only two people are talking, a dialogue tag is often necessary later in the conversation. This is especially the case if the conversation goes on for a long time and it isn't broken up with a lot of action or exposition. Detective stories, for example, often feature long conversations between an investigator and a suspect or a witness. The investigator asks the suspect a long series of questions and the suspect answers. Some writers introduce the two characters at the start and then dispense with dialogue tags entirely. They're acting on the assumption that it's clear from the dialogue itself who is speaking, simply by virtue of the fact that the detective is usually asking the questions and the other character is usually answering them. And this often works pretty well, especially if the internal cues in each line of dialogue are clear. Sometimes the detective comes from a different social class than the suspect. And in that case, you can tell the difference because the detective speaks in one dialect and the suspect speaks in a different dialect, though the use of dialect raises issues of its own that I'll talk about in the next lecture. But even if the writer is careful to distinguish between the two speakers, sometimes a reader can get confused about just who is saying what, especially during a long exchange. I've certainly had this experience, and I'm sure you have too. There have been times when I've had to go back to the first moment where the speakers were identified and count forward by twos or however many characters there were. In cases like this, it might have helped if the writer had thrown in a dialogue tag every few lines, like a signpost, so we didn't have to keep track on our fingers. Another thing to remember about dialogue tags is that when you do use them, you want to keep them as simple as possible and to avoid over-explaining them. Again, some other writers might say differently, but it's my feeling that you want to avoid verbs that are too descriptive. As I've already said, you want the speech itself to carry as much of the meaning as possible, without unnecessary help from a dialogue tag. In my example about the simple sentence, "I love you," a few moments ago, I suggested that you could clear up the ambiguity of such a statement with a stronger verb than a simple "she said." You might say "she sobbed" instead, which gives you a more definitive impression of the speaker's emotion and intent. Or you might add an adverb to the dialogue tag for the same reason. Again, "I love you," she said casually, is clearer and less ambiguous than simply "I love you," she said. But if you have a piece of dialogue where the meaning itself is sharper and more definitive, you might not need the stronger verb or adverb at all. For example, "You're a clumsy idiot," said the coach, is probably clear enough without any extra emphasis, depending on what else is going on in the narrative. Another example, "You're a clumsy idiot," snarled the coach, seems to me to remain within the bounds of necessity, since it tells us something about the coach's vehemence and anger that we might not have gotten from the first example. However, "You're a clumsy idiot," said the coach disparagingly, is simply unnecessary. It's already clear from what the coach said that he's disparaging whomever he's talking to. We don't need the dialogue tag to tell us that the coach is being disparaging. We can hear it for ourselves. And the sentence, "You're a clumsy idiot," snarled the coach disparagingly, is just over the top. Any one of these examples, except maybe the last one, could still be permissible depending on the context. But you need to walk a fine line between leaving the dialogue too ambiguous on the one hand and over-explaining it on the other. When using dialogue tags, less is more. I'll say it again. You want the actual words the character is speaking to carry as much of the dialogue's meaning as possible. Now here's my final rule of thumb. The most graceful and evocative way to write dialogue is not to separate it out from the rest of the narrative, but to interweave it with the narrative as much as possible. In real life, people don't necessarily stop whatever else they're doing to talk to each other, but they carry on conversations while they're doing all sorts of things. And even if they do stop and concentrate on their conversation, each participant in that conversation is taking note of the other person's facial expression, gestures, and body language. Dialogue usually works best when it is an integral part of a scene that combines thoughts, actions, and the speech of your characters. To show you what I mean, here's a passage of dialogue from my novel Next, in which my main character Kevin, who is an academic editor, is having a meeting with Eileen, the professor who has just become his new boss. Kevin is trying to present the budget for the publication program he manages, while Eileen is standing behind her desk looking at carpet swatches for her new office. Here's the bare bones of the dialogue, just the direct quotations themselves, with the bare minimum of dialogue tags. "I've seen you at the gym," Eileen said. "Yes," Kevin said. "I assume that's your lunch hour?" "Yeah, I play a pickup game with some guys 2-3 days a week." "So the game itself lasts, what, 45 minutes? Maybe a little less. So by the time you walk over there, change your clothes, warm up, play the game, shower, and walk back to your office, that's what? An hour and a quarter? An hour and a half?" "Come on, Eileen, I see you at the gym all the time." "I'm not on the clock. May I call you Kevin?" "Of course." "Kevin, you're not salaried like I'm salaried. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly. I'll look over your budget, and we'll have a talk about it soon," said Eileen. Now, even with just the speech and nothing else, this is a reasonably clear passage of dialogue. It's obvious what's happening. Eileen is being imperious and condescending, and Kevin is being nervous and defensive. Even without any description of their actions or gestures or thoughts, it gets the point across. And even without being told anything else about them, you get a pretty vivid idea of what sort of people Kevin and Eileen are. Now, here's the scene as it appeared in the book. In this version, we have a bit more description of what Kevin and Eileen are actually doing as they speak. More importantly, because the novel is told entirely from Kevin's point of view, we have access to Kevin's thoughts. I'm also including a bit of the paragraph just before the exchange to show how the dialogue arises out of this particular situation. Eileen continued to stand and sort through swatches while Kevin delivered his little State of the Pubs program address, complete with a spreadsheet printed out that morning from Excel. "I've seen you at the gym," she said, still standing. "Yes." Kevin brightened. "She remembers me." "I assume that's your lunch hour?" Still she wouldn't meet his eye, but instead glanced from a wine-red swatch in her left hand to a blue one in her right. "Yeah," he said casually. "I play a pickup game with some guys 2-3 days a week." "So," she said, laying down the blue swatch and picking up a bluer one, "the game itself lasts, what, 45 minutes? Maybe a little less? Uh-oh. So by the time you walk over there, change your clothes, warm up, play the game, shower, and sauna," thought Kevin, but he knew better than to say so, "and walk back to your office, that's what, an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half?" Still she wasn't looking at him. "Come on, Eileen," Kevin said collegially. "I see you at the gym all the time." "I'm not on the clock." She let both swatches fall from her hands in disgust and then said with icy politesse, "May I call you Kevin?" "Of course." He could feel himself dwindling in the chair. "Kevin?" Eileen fixed him with glacially blue eyes. "You're not salaried like I'm salaried." His feet dangled above the carpet. His head shrank into his collar. "Do we understand each other?" Eileen said. "Perfectly," said Kevin, the incredible shrinking man. The meeting was over. "I'll look over your budget," she said as he walked, vibrating with rage, across the crummy old carpet to the door, "and we'll have a talk about it soon." Now, the second version is not necessarily better than the first, but it does have the advantage of being more complete, more evocative, and more complex. The first version is shorter and sharper, but it doesn't give you any visual cues about the setting of the character. Even though you can infer each character's state of mind from what he or she says, you can't know it for sure. The first version leaves a lot for the reader to fill in. On the other hand, the second version integrates the dialogue with the setting, with the physical presence of Kevin and Eileen, and with Kevin's thoughts. Take their very first exchange, for example. In the first version, Eileen simply says, "I've seen you at the gym." And Kevin simply replies, "Yes." It's direct and clear, but it tells you very little about each character. It isn't until we get further into that version of the dialogue that we start to understand how it's going to go badly for Kevin. Now look at the second version again. "I've seen you at the gym," she said, still standing. "Yes." Kevin brightened. "She remembers me." This second version is only 5 words longer than the first version, but already we're getting very subtle, almost subliminal cues that this conversation won't end well. The fact that Eileen remains standing should be a warning sign for Kevin. Instead, he misreads her mood, and he brightens, thinking that she remembers him from the gym. This implies that he didn't expect her to remember seeing him there, and it further implies that he expects the fact that they both use the gym to be common ground between them. We don't get any of this from the first version, or at least we only get the barest hint of it. Then, as the second version progresses, we learn along the way, through some very simple details, that Eileen can be cold, at least with a subordinate. She speaks with icy politesse, and she looks at Kevin with glacially blue eyes. We can also infer that she has little respect for Kevin from the fact that she does not give him her full attention, but continues to sort through the carpet swatches while she talks to him. But this isn't just busy work in order to show the character doing something. These particular gestures act in counterpoint to her actual dialogue. They show her physically judging something as she starts to verbally judge Kevin, until, at the moment she lowers the boom on him, she lets both swatches fall from her hands in disgust. Her gesture reinforces her disapproval of Kevin's long lunch hours. And by the same token, we learn much more about Kevin in the second version. Since the novel is told from his point of view, we have access to his thoughts. And as the dialogue progresses, we don't have to infer his anxiety the way we do in the first version of the passage. Instead, we can actually see it happening in real time. We can hear his attempts to keep it light, such as when he speaks casually or collegially. We can see how his anxiety is expressed at first in little silent asides like, uh-oh, or he knew better than to say so. And finally, we see his anxiety expressed as comic hyperbole, such as when he starts to feel himself diminish under her gaze, becoming the incredible shrinking man. The dialogue and his silent internal monologue reinforce each other. His attempt to keep it light only heightens his anxiety, and his anxiety makes his excuses seem even more feeble. In the first version, with the dialogue alone, we are witnessing a conversation. But in the second version, we are participating in it, at least from Kevin's point of view. We feel how he starts to feel smaller under Eileen's icy gaze, and we feel him vibrating with repressed rage as he leaves her office. And that effect is the result of interweaving the dialogue with visual cues and physical sensations, and by giving the reader access to at least one of the character's thoughts. It would be easy to take the same exchange and write it from Eileen's point of view, showing us what Kevin looks like to her, cringing in his chair, and we'll talk more about that in the lectures about point of view. In my second lecture on dialogue, we'll be looking at examples from a wide variety of novels and stories, including David Copperfield, The Maltese Falcon, and Anna Karenina, as well as Toni Morrison's Beloved, Elmore Leonard's Cuba Libre, and Alice Munro's story Walker Brothers Cowboy. In the meantime, here's an exercise you can use to help you think about writing dialogue and incorporating it into the rest of the narrative. It's very simple. Just write out a dialogue, say half a page or a page, between two people who are at cross purposes to each other. One is in love and the other isn't, for example, or one wants something that the other doesn't want to give up. In the first version, write it like a play, with no dialogue tags or even the names of the characters, just the dialogue itself. Then take that dialogue and start layering in more stuff. Do a version with basic dialogue tags, then a version with slightly more descriptive dialogue tags, then a version with a little bit of action and physical description, then a version with access to the character's thoughts, and so on. I think you'll find that each different version has a very different effect. Depending on what effect you prefer, you may find that the simplest version is the best, or you might find that one of the more complicated versions is. Which one you choose depends on what purpose the dialogue has in the larger narrative, and that is what I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. In my first lecture about dialogue, I said that speech in fiction has to serve a purpose, no matter how rambling, digressive, elaborate, or colorful it is. I also said that, generally speaking, dialogue is used to evoke character, advance the story, and provide exposition. In this lecture, I want to talk in more detail about how you can use dialogue to serve those purposes. And I also want to talk about how you can find the balance between dialogue and the other parts of the narrative. Some stories and novels are made up almost entirely of dialogue, while some stories use it only as a seasoning, so to speak. Deciding just how much, how often, and how effectively your characters speak will also help you decide just what sort of story you're writing. Let's start with using dialogue to evoke character. As I said in my earlier lectures, character is usually evoked through a variety of techniques, all at once or in close succession. These include description, action, dialogue, interior monologue, and so on. While dialogue doesn't always bear the brunt of characterization, it's certainly not unusual for individual characters to talk in a distinctive way. Charles Dickens is especially known for his colorful secondary characters, who often use catchphrases or speak in a particular dialect. In David Copperfield, for example, there are a number of characters who are memorable for using repeated phrases or words. The oily Uriah Heep, who is one of the villains of the book, frequently mentions how humble he is. The perpetually debt-ridden Mr. Micawber is always counting on the fact that something will turn up. His loyal wife, Mrs. Micawber, who is forced to make do because of his financial ineptitude, constantly swears that she will never desert Micawber. George R.R. Martin, who has proven to be a sort of latter-day Dickens in the scope, variety, and detail of his many colorful characters, also uses this technique with the characters in his fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire. The noble Eddard Stark is always repeating the motto of his house, "Winter is coming." And the wilding warrior Ygritte is always telling her lover, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And the members of the villainous Lannister family love to repeat their ominous slogan, "A Lannister always pays his debts." It's more common, however, for a character to have a distinctive pattern of speech which makes him or her instantly recognizable, rather than an oft-repeated catchphrase. The aforementioned Mr. Micawber, for example, is especially distinguished by his comically elaborate way of expressing himself. It's probably the most memorable thing about him. Here he is, saying goodbye to his friends David Copperfield and Tommy Traddles, as he prepares to move his family to a new job in another city. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, rising with one of his thumbs in each of his waistcoat pockets, "the companion of my youth, if I may be allowed the expression, and my esteemed friend Traddles, if I may be permitted to call him so, will allow me, on the part of Mrs. Micawber, myself, and our offspring, to thank them in the warmest and most uncompromising terms for their good wishes. It may be expected that on the eve of a migration which will consign us to a perfectly new existence," Mr. Micawber spoke as if they were going 500,000 miles, "I should offer a few valedictory remarks to two such friends as I see before me." Now this goes on for another 4 paragraphs, and it's a lot of fun to read. But by modern standards, it does rather hit the same nail over and over again. A somewhat more modern example is the erudite and rather jolly criminal Caspar Gutman from the Maltese Falcon. Gutman has something of Micawber's pomposity, but he is a much cleverer and more menacing man. Here he is, taking his leave of Sam Spade at the end of the book. "Now, sir, we will say goodbye to you unless—" the fat puffs around his eyes crinkled. "You care to undertake the Constantinople expedition with us? You don't? Well, sir, frankly, I'd like to have you along. You're a man to my liking, a man of many resources and nice judgment. Because we know you're a man of nice judgment, we know we can say goodbye with every assurance that you'll hold the details of our little enterprise in confidence. We know we can count on you to appreciate the fact that, as the situation now stands, any legal difficulties that come to us in connection with these last few days would likewise and equally come to you and the charming Miss O'Shaughnessy. You're too shrewd not to recognize that, sir, I'm sure." Now this sort of speech works well in stories where the characters are a bit more extreme than they might be in a more realistic narrative. Micawber is a comic character in a Dickens melodrama, while Caspar Gutman is a charismatic villain in a noir thriller. When creating more complex characters in less outrageous circumstances, you probably want to tone it down a bit. I want to say a few words here about using dialect in fiction. In the 19th century, lots of writers used it, with the result that a lot of 19th century fiction is now unreadable. In Dracula, for example, there's a long passage in which Bram Stoker tries to reproduce the accent of an old sailor from Yorkshire, and it's almost incomprehensible. Most readers just skip it. More controversially, dialect can come across as offensive or stereotypical. In Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain reproduced the African-American dialect of the runaway slave Jim. 50 years later, Zora Neale Hurston had her African-American characters speak in dialect in her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Both Twain and Hurston were recreating patterns of speech they knew from personal experience. In Hurston's case, she was African-American herself, as well as an anthropologist and a folklorist who had done extensive field work across the American South and the Caribbean. But even these two great American writers have been criticized for perpetuating what some critics consider to be a racist stereotype. The problem with dialect is twofold. With its dropped G's, bristling apostrophes, and phonetic spellings, it's often hard to follow. The other problem is that unless the entire work is written in dialect, as Huckleberry Finn is, for example, using dialect while the rest of the narrative is in standard English can have the effect of setting its speakers apart as other and not normal. As a result, it's difficult for the reader to think of them as fully human. Today, most writers evoke dialect in a more subtle fashion. They rely on word choice and variations in grammar and syntax to suggest regional speech or social class, instead of trying to reproduce it in every detail. Consider Beloved, the great novel by Toni Morrison about an African-American family coping with the aftermath of slavery in the years after the Civil War. The characters speak a straightforward, conversational, modern English. Now and then, they use just a bit of slang or non-standard syntax or grammar to suggest their race, social class, and the era. Here's a scene in which the main character, Setha, a pregnant slave who is making a run for her freedom, has gone into labor in a field of wild onions. She has just been discovered by a poor young white girl named Amy. Picking her way through the brush, Amy hollered back to Setha, "What you gonna do, just lay there and fool?" "I can't get up from here," said Setha. "What?" She stopped and turned to hear. "I said I can't get up." Amy drew her arm across her nose and came slowly back to where Setha lay. "It's a house back yonder," she said. "A house? I passed it. Ain't no regular house with people in it, though. A lean-to, kinda. How far? Make a difference, does it? You stay the night here, snake get you." "Well, you may as well come on. I can't stand up, let alone walk, and God help me, miss, I can't crawl." "Sure you can. Come on," said Amy. This is as close to dialect as Morrison gets in the book. She has Amy use a few slang expressions like gonna and kinda, and some non-standard usage like ain't, and some non-standard constructions like saying it's a house back yonder instead of there's a house back there. It suggests a time and place without the kind of slavish and often off-putting verisimilitude that Twain and Hurston deployed. What it loses in exactitude, it gains in immediacy and intimacy by giving us characters that any reader of any background can identify with. Another author who makes subtle and effective use of dialect is the Scottish mystery writer Denise Mina, whose novels are often set in working-class Glasgow. Instead of troweling on the Scottish dialect, she drops in the occasional turn of phrase or regional slang, using I for yes, for example, or bairn for child. In this way, she conveys a sense of place and of the economic status of each character without making them sound like Groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons. As I said in my lectures about character, people in fiction generally have something at stake or something that they want. The best way to use dialogue to evoke character is to have them express what they want, though not necessarily directly. In other words, creating effective dialogue for a character involves inhabiting that character's point of view and not necessarily reproducing an accent or a particular pattern of speech. Reviews of fiction often talk about what a great ear a writer has. But creating a character's speech is less about reproducing a dialect or speech mannerism and more about thinking hard about who that character is, where she comes from, and how her speech might reflect her situation at a given moment. A terse character is going to talk in short bursts. An angry character is going to bluster or speak through clenched teeth. A nervous character is going to stammer or ramble on and on. A domineering character might not say much of anything at all, but keep her thoughts to herself, forcing everyone around her to fill in the silence. Or she might rage, overwhelming the people around her. Sometimes characters don't talk about what they want or about the situation they're in. Instead, they might talk about something tangential or even completely unrelated, and their style of speech serves to evoke both the speaker and the milieu. One of the masters of evoking character almost entirely through speech was the crime novelist and former Boston prosecutor George V. Higgins. Here's part of a monologue from the first chapter of his novel, The Friends of Eddie Coyle. In this excerpt, the title character, a small-time Boston criminal, is talking about the time two thugs broke his hand. What made it hurt more, the stocky man said. What made it hurt worse was knowing what they were going to do to you, you know? There you are, and they tell you very matter-of-fact that you made somebody mad. You made a big mistake, and now there's somebody doing time for it. And it isn't anything personal, you understand. It just has to be done. Now get your hand out there. You think about not doing it, you know? I was in Sunday school when I was a kid, and this nun says to me, stick out your hand. And the first few times I do it, she whacks me right across the knuckles with a steel-edged ruler. It was just like that. So one day I says, when she tells me, put out your hand, I say no. And she whaps me right across the face with that ruler. Same thing. Except these guys weren't mad. They aren't mad at you, you know? Guys you see all the time, maybe guys you didn't like, maybe guys you did, had some drinks with, maybe you looked out for the girls. Hey, look, Paulie, nothing personal, you know? You made a mistake. The hand. I don't want to have to shoot you, you know? So you stick out the hand, and you get to put out the hand you want. I take the left because I'm right-handed, and I know what's going to happen. It's like I say. And they put your fingers in a drawer, and then one of them kicks it shut. You ever hear bones breaking? Just like a man snapping a shingle. Hurts like a bastard. In its own way, this is as beautiful as a Puccini aria. It's got rhythm, it's got music, and it tells a little self-contained story. Best of all, it gives you Eddie Coyle, his history, his world, in his own voice, in less than 300 words. It also intrigues the reader and prepares the way for the story to come. And that's a good segue to my next topic, using dialogue to tell the story. The Friends of Eddie Coyle tells a story about an armed robbery and its aftermath, mainly through a series of monologues and conversations. Some of these almost read like a play by Samuel Beckett, if Beckett had been an assistant U.S. attorney. The use of dialogue in crime narratives and detective stories is especially interesting, because a mystery often consists of two stories told in tandem with each other. One is the story of the investigation, which is usually chronological, and the other is the story of the events that led up to the crime. This second story is revealed to the reader in bits and pieces, not necessarily in chronological order. This backstory is often told entirely in dialogue, as the detective questions suspects or listens to long statements from witnesses. For example, large sections of the Sherlock Holmes stories are told through dialogue. Characters tell Holmes what they saw, heard, or did, and at the end, Holmes himself gives a long speech that reveals to Watson what actually happened. Another example is our old friend the Maltese Falcon. This novel is almost entirely made up of scenes in which the characters argue, plead, negotiate, and bully each other in offices, apartments, and hotel rooms around San Francisco. There are a few scenes of violent action, but most of the violence, in particular 2 shootings and a fire on a freighter, takes place off stage, so to speak. The most important elements of the plot involve what the characters say to each other as they fight for advantage, betray each other, and reveal their true natures, all in dialogue. But it isn't just crime fiction that uses dialogue to move the plot along. Another talky novel is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Many of the most important encounters and incidents take place in conversation. During a scene at a ball in Chapter 18, the novel's proud heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, finds herself dancing against her will with the novel's haughty leading man, Mr. Darcy, and the two verbally spar with each other for 3 pages. It's too long to quote here, but it's one of the great romantic duels in literature, and it's one of the models for every scene since in which 2 lovers spend the first meeting loathing each other. Another one of the novel's most famous scenes is another verbal jousting match near the end of the book. This one is between Elizabeth and the imperious Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who tries to bully Elizabeth into giving up any hopes of marrying her nephew, Mr. Darcy. Again, it's too long to quote, but you can find it in chapter 56 of Pride and Prejudice. It's one of the great smackdowns in literature, and it's conducted almost entirely in dialogue. But this is not to say that every conversation in fiction is a kind of competition or argument. As I said at the start, people in fiction speak to each other for all the reasons people in real life do. And people in fiction are just as capable of misdirection, confusion, and reticence as real people are. Some of the greatest scenes in literature feature characters who are not actually talking about what's at stake in the scene, but about something else entirely. Characters talk past each other. They lie. They manipulate. They are inarticulate. Sometimes they don't even realize what they're saying or not saying. Dialogue can hide a character's intent as well as show it. Often the meaning of a dialogue is more evident in what the characters don't say than in what they do. A wonderful example is from Part 6 of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina at the start of Chapter 5. In this scene, two minor characters, a middle-aged man named Sergei Ivanovich and a middle-aged woman named Varenka, are picking mushrooms in the forest. Each is in love with the other, and they both sort of know it. Not only is Sergei working up his nerve to ask for Varenka's hand in marriage, but Varenka is expecting him to propose at any moment. Here's the crucial moment where Tolstoy, in the godlike way of the great 19th century novelists, puts us inside both characters' heads simultaneously. And now it was to be decided. She was frightened that he would speak and that he would not. He had to declare himself now or never. Sergei Ivanovich felt it too. Everything in Varenka's gaze, color, lowered eyes showed painful expectation. Sergei Ivanovich saw it and pitied her. He even felt that to say nothing now would be to insult her. In his mind, he quickly repeated all the arguments in favor of his decision. He also repeated to himself the words in which he wished to express his proposal. But instead of those words, by some unexpected consideration that occurred to him, he suddenly asked, "And what is the difference between a white boletus and a birch boletus?" Varenka's lips trembled as she answered, "There's hardly any difference in the caps, but in the feet." And as soon as these words were spoken, both he and she understood that the matter was ended, and that what was to have been said would not be said, and their excitement, which had reached its highest point just before then, began to subside. "In the birch boletus, the foot resembles a 2-day growth of beard on a dark-haired man," Sergei Ivanovich said, calmly now. "Yes, that's true," Varenka replied, smiling, and the direction of their walk changed inadvertently. This is one of the most heartbreaking passages I have ever read. Two people coming this close to happiness and mutually losing their nerve. It's the kind of utterly human misunderstanding that has been played for laughs in countless romantic comedies, but Tolstoy allows the inherent tragedy at the heart of this exchange to come to full flower. The most heartbreaking feature of it is the fact that the dialogue in this scene has nothing to do with what's really on the characters' minds. They're thinking about love, but they're talking about mushrooms. And yet, even though the dialogue itself does not actually address the matter at hand or directly express any of the repressed emotion, this seemingly pointless dialogue is crucial to the devastating effect of the scene. In fact, the scene would not work without it. The intensity of their private emotions is juxtaposed on the page with their banal statements about mushrooms. Sergei Ivanovich agonizes for 88 words, pitying Varenka, worrying that he might insult her. In his head, at lightning speed, he reviews one more time all the reasons he should propose to her. Then, when the moment comes, he asks her a useless question about 2 different types of boletus mushroom. Varenka's lips tremble before she gives him an equally banal answer. They both know what's going on, but neither of them will say it aloud. The banality of their speech is the necessary counterpoint to the depth of their feelings. This counterpoint shows us that the one thing Varenka really wants to hear is the one thing Sergei Ivanovich can't bring himself to say. This oblique use of dialogue has become even more subtle in contemporary short fiction. Under the influence of the great short fiction writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as Anton Chekhov, James Joyce, and Catherine Mansfield, many contemporary short story writers often create powerful scenes in which the dialogue acts in counterpoint to what is actually going on. An expert practitioner of this technique is the great Nobel Prize-winning Canadian writer Alice Munro. In Walker Brothers' Cowboy, the very first story of her first collection, Dance of the Happy Shades, she was already a master of the technique. The story is about a married salesman named Ben, who takes his 2 children with him one day into rural Ontario, where he stops at the house of a woman named Nora, whom he hasn't seen in years. The story is narrated in the present tense by Ben's daughter, but the voice is that of an adult looking back on a situation that she didn't understand at the time. The story is set in the 1930s, and near the end of it, Nora plays a phonograph record and makes the narrator, Ben's daughter, dance with her. As you listen to this excerpt, note how few dialogue tags Munro uses. She whirls me around in front of my father, causing me to stumble, for I am by no means so swift a pupil as she pretends, and lets me go, breathless. Dance with me, Ben. I'm the world's worst dancer, Nora, and you know it. I certainly never thought so. You would now. She stands in front of him, arms hanging loose and hopeful, her breasts, which a moment ago embarrassed me with their warmth and bulk, rising and falling under her loose flowered dress, her face shining with the exercise and delight. Ben. My father drops his head and says quietly, "Not me, Nora." This is almost as heartbreaking as the scene from Anna Karenina, but it has a more subtle effect than that scene did for a number of reasons. One reason is that Munro only tells us what her narrator is thinking, unlike Tolstoy, who tells us exactly what both Sergei Ivanovich and Varenka are thinking. We have no direct access to the thoughts of Ben and Nora. We have to infer their emotions from what they say and do, and we can only guess, along with the narrator, what happened between them years ago. Munro's narrator never comes right out and says, "This woman was an old flame of my father's, and now she wants him back." Instead, she allows us to experience the situation as the narrator did, picking up the cues from what she hears and observes, from the way Nora begs him to dance with her and the way he refuses, from the way her arms hang loose and hopeful and her face shines with delight, and from the way he drops his head and says, "Not me, Nora." Now, in The Maltese Falcon and Pride and Prejudice, the dialogue is more direct and instrumental, with the characters speaking directly to the matter at hand. And in Anna Karenina, Tolstoy makes the subtext explicit by telling us what the characters are thinking. But Alice Munro's dialogue is oblique. It carries a lot of emotion, but it stops just short of addressing the root cause of the emotion. Finally, the most mechanical use of dialogue is to provide exposition. This is the use of dialogue to have one character explain the backstory or impart some necessary information, ostensibly to another character, but in reality to the reader. When it's done stylishly and evokes character at the same time, it can be a lot of fun. One expert practitioner of expository dialogue was the great American crime novelist Elmore Leonard. Sometimes Leonard also wrote westerns and historical fiction, and his novel Cuba Libre is about an American who gets caught up in the Spanish-American War in 1898. The first chapter of the novel provides an excellent example of using dialogue for exposition. In this chapter, 2 of the novel's major characters, a couple of cowboys who are planning to ship some horses to Cuba, sit with their feet up on the railing of a hotel in Texas and talk about their deal. During this conversation, they fill in their own backstories and, at the same time, provide the reader with a quick and dirty history of the war in Cuba. It goes on for several pages, but here's just a taste of it. Tyler said, "What about the war going on down there? It was in the paper the whole time I was at Yuma, the Cubans fighting for their independence. They were getting to it now." "It isn't like a real war," Charlie Burke said. "The 2 sides line up and shoot at each other. It's more like a hit and run. The Cuban insurgents blow up railroad tracks, raid the big estates, burn down sugar mills, and the Spanish army, the Dons, chase after them. You understand that's what gives us our market, replacing the stock they run off or kill. Once I'd made a few trips for a Texas outfit, ships cattle down there, it dawned on me, hell, I can run this kind of business. No time at all, I'm living in railroad hotels and drinking red wine with my supper. This is very economically and charmingly done. It tells us what we need to know about the politics of the situation they're getting themselves into, or at least enough to start with. At the same time, it still sounds like a couple of guys sitting around and talking. But even in this expertly written passage, we never quite lose sight of the fact that Elmore Leonard is sneaking a little history past us. It's painlessly done, and he introduces us to two important characters at the same time, but it's not as seamless or engrossing as the rest of the book. Even for a great writer like Elmore Leonard, working in the exposition can be tricky. We've all read books in which an especially flat minor character is wheeled on to explain the backstory and then wheeled off, never to be heard from again. Take the second chapter of Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, for example. A character named Dr. Mortimer introduces the necessary background of the case by reading aloud from a couple of documents and then telling Holmes and Watson what he himself witnessed. Mortimer is thinly characterized as a practical-minded country doctor, but his main function in the story is to turn up from time to time and explain things. After delivering that backstory in the introductory chapter, Mortimer could disappear, and the book would be essentially the same without him. So instead of trying to shoehorn exposition into dialogue, I would suggest three alternate methods. The simplest way is just to flat out violate the old show-don't-tell rule and provide the information directly to the reader in the narration itself. This is what I usually do. In two of my novels, The Lecturer's Tale and Kings of Infinite Space, I have a dramatic opening chapter or two to draw the reader into the story. Then I put the main narrative on hold while I fill in the background of the main character for a whole chapter. If your story is told in the first person, and that narrator is privy to the information you need to get across, you could have him or her do the same thing. Or, if the information absolutely has to come from a particular character at a particular moment in the story, you should consider using what's known as indirect dialogue, which is a summary of what a character has said without using his or her exact words. For example, you could distill Eddie Coyle's speech about getting his fingers broken into indirect dialogue, like this. Eddie explained that getting your fingers broken was like having the nuns slap your hand with a ruler back in Sunday school. They'd tell you to hold out your hand, and knowing what was going to happen only made the pain worse. The difference, Eddie said, was that the guys who broke your fingers weren't mad at you. They made you choose a hand and put your fingers in a drawer, then they'd kick the drawer shut. Eddie said it hurt like a bastard. Now, this doesn't have the poetry of the original, but it gets across the same information more quickly. In the next lecture, I'll be starting a block of 6 lectures about plot. In the introductory lecture, I'll be comparing 3 different types of plot, using as examples Joseph Conrad's novel Lord Jim, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and the Bruce Willis movie Die Hard. Meanwhile, here's another dialogue exercise. Without invading anybody's privacy, take a fragment of real-life conversation, one you may have been party to, or a brief exchange between 2 people you may have overheard in a public place, and try to construct a more lengthy and detailed dialogue out of it. It could be something as banal as one person asking, "Is this seat taken?" and the other replying, "No, it isn't." Or it could be freighted with significance, such as one person saying to another, "So what did you tell him?" and the other person saying, "I told him no." Whatever fragment you use, start by figuring out what the next line would be and try to spin as much out of it as you can, incorporating as many of the uses to which dialogue can be put as you can. In other words, starting with just 2 overheard lines, use dialogue to create a couple of characters and tell a little story. It may sound daunting, and it may be a bit tough to get started, depending on what 2 sentences you start with. But once you get going, I think you can have fun with it. The point of the exercise is to reinforce what I've been saying in these 2 lectures, namely that dialogue is not a separate beast from the rest of fiction writing, but an integral part of storytelling that can bear the weight of almost everything fiction can do. In this first of 6 lectures about plot, I want to take as scripture something that my freshman English teacher at Big Rapids High School told me before I was 14 years old. Even at that age, I already knew that I wanted to be a writer, and my English teacher, Mrs. Nancy Giltner, saw at least enough promise in me to offer me the following insight and to trust that I would understand it. Literature, Mrs. Giltner said, is the creation of order out of chaos. It is the creation of meaning and structure out of a reality that is otherwise meaningless and without structure. Another way to put this insight is to say that real life does not happen in stories. It's true that our lives have beginnings, middles, and ends. But unlike a story, where the writer chooses which events are important and arranges them in a meaningful way, real life happens in a seamless, irresistible flow that does not break itself into discrete, well-rounded scenes. We do not speak in carefully crafted sentences. Our lives don't necessarily have clear conflicts, and our lives do not necessarily resolve neatly, the way lives resolve in stories. We are carried from the birth canal to the grave in a relentless stream of experience, surrounded by countless other people who are experiencing the same thing. While some of our experiences are more important than others, it's only because we choose to impose meaning upon them, often, in fact, by telling stories. Stories, in other words, are not natural. They are created in an arbitrary process through which the writer picks and chooses from a nearly infinite set of possibilities and makes something orderly and significant out of it. Stories are often what make our lives meaningful, bearable, and even joyful. But we impose stories on real life, not the other way around. At this point in these lectures, this should not be news to you. We've already looked at several ways that fiction imposes order on chaos. When we evoke a scene or a situation, we pick and choose the details that best get across what we want the reader to see and understand. When we create character, we pretend to get inside the heads of other people, and we pick and choose traits to make a lifelike individual out of a handful of details. And when we write dialogue, we suggest real speech without actually reproducing it. We impose purpose on speech that, in real life, can be messy, halting, and digressive. But perhaps the most important way fiction imposes order on chaos is through the creation of stories and plots. Often people will look at a real-life situation and say something like, "Boy, that would make a great novel." Writers get this all the time. Sometimes, after I've told a friend of mine something that happened to me in real life, that friend will say to me, "Well, there's your next book." Stories are so prevalent in human cultures and in our own personal lives that it's easy to think that they occur naturally in the world. We sometimes think that stories are like fruit hanging from a tree, and that all a writer has to do is pluck them. But it's more complicated than that. Taking what Mrs. Giltner told me as scripture, it becomes axiomatic that all fiction has a structure. Even for narrative works that don't have plots, all fiction can be broken down into a few fundamental components. Specifically, all stories have a situation or a context, at least one character, a conflict of some sort, and a resolution to that conflict. All these elements are inextricably linked in every work of fiction, and if you're missing one of them, it won't work. The initial situation needs to be dramatically productive. In other words, the initial situation needs to produce a conflict. Furthermore, the character or characters need to have some sort of relationship to that situation. The conflict can be external to the characters, or it can be an internal conflict within a character. And the resolution must resolve that conflict in some believable and dramatically satisfying way, though not necessarily happily or pleasantly. Sometimes, in fact, the resolution of the conflict is that it doesn't get resolved. We'll look at that paradox in a later lecture, when I talk about narratives that don't use an ordinary plot. And let me add just one more thing. All fiction must possess a quality that the writer and teacher John Gardner called profluence. He defined profluence as the feeling you have when you're reading a novel or short story that you're getting someplace. Another way to think of this quality is simply to call it forward momentum. Whether you're writing a highly plotted, complicated story like Game of Thrones or Harry Potter, or a modernist plotless masterpiece like Mrs. Dalloway or Thomas Pynchon's epic novel Gravity's Rainbow, you need to give the reader a reason to keep turning the pages. Profluence doesn't necessarily mean that a story has a plot per se. In a conventional narrative, you read to find out what happens next, but there are other reasons to keep reading. Sometimes, as in a plotless story like Anton Chekhov's story, The Kiss, you read to gain a deeper understanding of the central character, even if that character, as in The Kiss, never comes to understand himself. Or you might read just to inhabit a strange and richly detailed world, or to enjoy their author's writing style. For example, plot is secondary in Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy of fantasy novels, but they are still tremendous fun to read. The profluence in those books comes from their evocative detail, their wonderfully strange characters, and the author's gorgeous prose. We're going to talk about non-traditional structures in a later lecture, but in this lecture and the next two lectures, I'm going to talk about the old-fashioned traditional plot, which is still, by far, the most common structure for fiction. I think it's safe to say that our culture is dominated by the traditional plot, and not just in prose fiction. If you've ever, as I have, devoted an entire weekend to devouring all the episodes of a single season of The Wire, Battlestar Galactica, or Breaking Bad, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. All three of these shows are superb feats of long-form storytelling, and they offer many other riches besides simply a gripping plot. But on a first viewing, they turn the question, what happens next, into something as addictive as Walter White's blue meth. And yet, some fiction writers remain uneasy with the idea of plot. In his book, The Art of Fiction, John Gardner called plotting the hardest job a writer has. And from among the writers of my own acquaintance, I've heard that plotting is the part of the job that usually gives them the most anxiety. Some writers even think of plot as slightly disreputable. All the elements of fiction are fundamentally arbitrary impositions of order on the formless chaos of reality, and yet plotting is somehow seen as even more arbitrary than the rest. Probably no one has expressed this uneasiness as productively as our old friend E.M. Forster in aspects of the novel. At the beginning of his second chapter, he imagines three types of reader and asks the question, what does a novel do? The first reader seems a bit puzzled, as if he'd never considered this before, and he says, well, a novel tells a story, I suppose. The next reader, who's a bit of a blowhard, says, why, a novel tells a story, of course, and I've got no use for it if it doesn't. The third reader is Forster himself, who says, in a sort of drooping, regretful voice, yes, oh dear, yes, the novel tells a story. He then says that he wishes this were not so, and he calls storytelling a low, atavistic form. He then goes on to compare a story to a tapeworm, calling it a series of simple, linked segments laid out in chronological order. A story, he says, can only have one merit, that of making the audience want to know what happens next. And conversely, it can only have one fault, that of making the audience not want to know what happens next. I'll confess that I sometimes share this ambivalence. You may recall that in my first lecture about character, I defended talking about character before anything else by making the argument that you can write about characters without a plot, but you can't create a plot without characters. I even said that all fiction is character-driven, but that some fiction is more character-driven than others. Well, I'm not taking any of that back, but I want to take what Forster said about the one merit and the one fault of storytelling, and I want to apply it to all fiction, not just storytelling. Here's my version. A work of fiction can only have one merit, that of making the reader want to keep reading. And it can only have one fault, that of making the reader not want to keep reading. Note that my version takes Gardner's idea of profluence into account. In other words, we may want to keep reading for other reasons than plot, and not just to find out what happens next. In fact, there are all sorts of ways of generating profluence that don't necessarily put storytelling up front. In a later lecture, I'll talk about other ways to structure fiction and to give it forward momentum in order to keep that hypothetical reader turning the pages. But right now, I want to make the case that creating a good, engrossing, and yes, entertaining plot is one of the most satisfying things a writer can do. And I also want to make the case that creating a plot is no more arbitrary than creating characters. Think back to the story I concocted in my very first lecture about Sarah and Brad, the couple at the baseball game whose marriage was on the rocks. You could take the same series of events and tell it from several different points of view, from Sarah's, from Brad's, from a mutual friend's, even from the godlike, omniscient point of view of a narrator. You could also play with the order of events in all sorts of ways. You could tell the story strictly chronologically, starting from Sarah and Brad's first meeting and ending with their divorce. Or you could start from the moment where Sarah tells Brad she's unhappy and then show their previous relationship in flashback. Or you could even tell the whole story backwards, the way Julia Alvarez tells the story of a Dominican-American family in her novel How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, or the way Harold Pinter tells the story of an adulterous love affair in his play Betrayal. Done well, each version of Sarah and Brad's story could be equally satisfying and meaningful, yet each would be very different from all the others. Each starts with the same series of events, but depending on how you order those events and whose point of view you tell them from, the same situation could amount to a completely different story in each version. Plotting is an incredibly powerful tool, but like any powerful tool, it's difficult to handle. If you don't take enough control over it, your plot will seem loose and formless with no forward momentum. You'll end up with a series of events that have no particular importance or obvious meaning, too much like real life, in other words. But if you use narrative too forcefully, you could end up with something melodramatic, mechanical, contrived, and unbelievable. We've all read books where the characters appear to be little more than puppets of the author. Even if the characters are fully rounded, they are often required to do unbelievable things in order for a plot to come out a certain way. So, how do we avoid contrivance? How do we create stories out of formless events and create an order that seems both satisfying and lifelike? Let's return to E.M. Forster again. He clarified this problem by making a distinction between stories and plots. In a very famous passage in Aspects of the Novel, he defines a story as simply a series of events linked by their chronology, but he defines a plot as a series of events linked by cause and effect. Here's Forster in his own words. The king died, and then the queen died, is a story. The king died, and then the queen died of grief, is a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it. Or again, the queen died, no one knew why, until it was discovered that it was through grief at the death of the king. This is a plot with a mystery in it, a form capable of high development. It suspends the time sequence, it moves as far away from the story as its limitations will allow. If it is in a story, we say, and then? If it is in a plot, we ask, why? Just like Forster's distinction between flat and round characters, this is one of the most famous tropes in creative writing. And like a lot of famous pronouncements, it's easy to oversimplify it. I still love placing things on a continuum, so perhaps it might help if we think of stories and plots being at the opposite ends of the same continuum, with the most basic chronological story at one end of the continuum and the most subtle plot at the other. Let's look at some examples. Often the most addictive stories are the ones that simply answer the question, as Forster puts it, and then? These are the stories we like best as children, the ones we beg our parents to read over and over again. On a first reading, children can't stand not knowing how the story turns out, but they insist on repeat readings because they take comfort in revisiting the same steps the story took in getting to the end. And children often insist on hearing the story told in exactly the same way, and they become frustrated and disappointed if you vary the details even slightly. This reinforces the idea that with a good story, it's not just the destination, it's the journey. And as we get older, that desire to learn the answer to "and then" never really leaves us. When you're gobbling down episodes of Breaking Bad and neglecting the rest of your life, you're watching the story in the same way you used to lose yourself in a book as a child. Much of the pleasure we derive from even a mediocre Hollywood blockbuster comes from watching the story unfold one plot point at a time. and we still derive that pleasure even if the story is predictable, as many blockbusters are. Take one of my favorite action pictures, for example, Die Hard, in which a tough New York City cop named John McClane takes on a bunch of terrorists in a Los Angeles skyscraper. Even watching that film for the very first time back in 1988, I pretty much knew how it was going to end. Spoiler alert, the terrorists lose. But the predictability of the plot didn't diminish my pleasure in watching the story twist and turn step by step to reach the inevitable triumph of Bruce Willis. And knowing exactly how it ends hasn't diminished my pleasure in watching it at least a half-dozen times since. Because it's a clever story with vivid, if not especially complicated characters. The film works as an unusually seductive sequence of and thens, with each sequence being a little more over the top than the last. Closer to the middle of the continuum, between story at one end and plot at the other, are such blockbuster literary series as the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling, or the epic fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, better known in its HBO version as Game of Thrones. The overarching story of each of these series of novels moves relentlessly forward chronologically. The Harry Potter books start with Harry Potter being chosen to attend the wizard's school at Hogwarts, and they end years later with an epic battle at the school between good and evil. A Song of Ice and Fire starts just before the start of an all-out war between several aristocratic houses, which will determine who is going to be the ruler of Martin's imaginary medieval world of Westeros. Each of these series are tremendous feats of old-fashioned storytelling. Just ask any of the countless readers who have stood in line at a bookstore on publication day and then raced home to do nothing for the next 24 hours but read the latest installment. But these narratives are more complicated than Die Hard. Whereas Die Hard moves forward chronologically with no flashbacks and only a few references in dialogue to previous events, most of the narrative momentum of Harry Potter involves Harry figuring out what happened between his parents and the villain Voldemort before he was born. We get this information in flashbacks, stories from other characters, mysterious documents, and magic visions. Rowling very skillfully mixes up the chronology of the backstory and gives us all sorts of information out of order, even as the main story moves unstoppably forward. Each of these non-chronological additions moves the Harry Potter books away from Forster's simple chronological tapeworm, what will happen to Harry next, and towards Forster's idea of a plot. Why is Harry so important? It's a plot, in other words, and not just a story. The construction of A Song of Ice and Fire is even more complicated. For one thing, the fictional world of Westeros has a long, convoluted history that precedes the events of the first book. And that previous history largely determines the existing relationships of the various aristocratic houses and the individual characters in them. For another thing, Martin's use of point of view is more complex than Rowling's. Whereas the Harry Potter books take place almost entirely from the point of view of Harry himself, A Song of Ice and Fire is told from the points of view of many characters, varying chapter by chapter. This also makes the chronology of A Song of Ice and Fire more complex. Especially in the later books, the same period of time is told from several different points of view, which means that the plot occasionally loops back on itself. And even though the books have a tremendous forward momentum, much of the pleasure in reading them comes from elements other than the plot. These other elements include the rich evocation of a fantasy world and access to the thoughts of some really interesting characters. In the end, of course, we want to know who wins the struggle for Westeros, and we want to know who lives and who dies. But along the way, there is much to savor that has little to do with simply answering the question, and then? Now, moving to the literary end of the story plot continuum, let's consider a book I talked about in my lectures about character, Joseph Conrad's great novel, Lord Jim. This book has one of the most complex plots in modern literature. Yet the basic events of the story are pretty simple. Bear with me as I go into a bit of detail. In the late 19th century, a romantic young Englishman, whom we know only as Jim, seeks his fortune as a sailor in the seas of South and Southeast Asia. Even before his career as a sailor has properly gotten started, he becomes the first mate of a rusting old freighter carrying Muslim pilgrims across the Indian Ocean to Mecca. When the freighter, called the Patna, collides with some unseen object in the water and threatens to sink, the rest of the crew prepares to abandon the ship, leaving the pilgrims to die. Jim considers himself superior to the other members of the crew, but at the last minute, he jumps into the lifeboat along with them. With this impulsive act, he instantly betrays his own sense of honor and shatters his naive conception of himself as heroic. After Jim and the rest of the crew are rescued and arrive in port, however, they learn that the Patna didn't sink after all. The rest of the crew disappear, but Jim deliberately turns himself in to the authorities in order to accept responsibility for what happened. At a tribunal of sea captains, he is stripped of his seaman's license, and his career and his reputation are ruined. After that, he drifts from job to job across Southeast Asia. Finally, he accepts a dangerous job far upriver on a remote island, and he helps a village defeat an oppressive warlord and win its freedom. By the end of the story, it looks as though Jim has found peace and redemption at last. But in a final series of incidents which I won't give away, his past returns to destroy him. Told this way, chronologically, this sounds like a pretty straightforward story. It's an action-packed one at that, featuring storms at sea, dramatic courtroom encounters, and battles in the jungle. And it is exciting. I read it for the first time at the age of 10, after seeing the movie version starring Peter O'Toole, and as a child, I read it strictly as an adventure story. What I didn't recognize at that age, however, was how complex the plotting was. And I couldn't understand how the complexity of that plotting made it into something richer and more melancholy than a mere adventure story. Bear with me again for a few moments as I compare the chronological version, Forster's idea of story, with the way Conrad actually tells it, Forster's idea of plot. As you may recall from my lecture on character, Lord Jim opens with a description of Jim marching straight off the page at the reader. As it happens, that moment actually comes about halfway through the chronological version of the story, several years after Jim's disgrace at the trial, but before he goes upriver into the jungle. After that introduction, Conrad then jumps back to Jim's upbringing in Britain, then works forward chronologically to the moment when the Patna runs over something in the water. At that point, without saying what happens to the ship, Conrad jumps to Jim in the witness box at the trial a month later. Up till now, the novel has been narrated in the third person, but now the story is picked up by a first-person narrator named Marlowe. This narrator is talking to some acquaintances on a hotel veranda long after the trial, but before the final events of the book. Marlowe tells them about attending the trial. Then he jumps back a few weeks to tell how he witnessed the arrival in port of the rescued crew of the Patna before it was discovered that the Patna hadn't actually sunk. Marlowe then returns to the trial with a long digression about one of the members of the tribunal, Captain Brierly, who commits suicide not long after the verdict. Then Marlowe tells of meeting of Jim in the street shortly after the verdict and of inviting him to dinner at his hotel. At this point, over the course of the next several chapters, Jim tells Marlowe what really happened that fateful night on the Patna. And that is only the first quarter of the book. The rest of the book is equally complex. I want you to note that not only does Conrad jumble the chronology, he also tells the story through several layers of point of view. There's the unnamed third-person narrator who starts the book. Then within that narration, there is Marlowe speaking in the first person within quotation marks. And within Marlowe's first-person account, there's Jim's account of what happened on the Patna, which is told in the third person by Marlowe with occasional snatches of Jim's actual words in the first person. Got all that? We're a long way from Die Hard here. In fact, we're even a long way from Game of Thrones. If you tell Lord Jim chronologically, it's a fairly straightforward tale about a young man who makes a bad mistake and then tries to redeem himself. But told the way Conrad does, through various narrators, with the story starting in the middle and looping backwards and forwards, it becomes an intimate and intense psychological study of a character who was not redeemed by his idealistic conception of honor, but in the end, destroyed by it. Now, think back to what Forster said about the difference between a story and a plot. A story answers the question, and then, and a plot answers the question, why? A simple story like Die Hard has a binary resolution. Does Bruce Willis defeat the terrorists, or doesn't he? Harry Potter is a bit more complicated because we learn a lot of backstory along the way. Also, the world of Harry Potter is more complex than the world of Die Hard. But in the end, the story comes down to another binary resolution. Does Harry Potter defeat Voldemort, or doesn't he? Game of Thrones is more complicated still, with more points of view, a more complex imaginary world, and a much darker view of human nature. Book by book, there are winners and losers, but the author complicates things by sometimes letting the people we hate win and letting the people we love lose and even die on occasion. Game of Thrones is a richer experience because it answers both questions. Readers rip through the books to find out what happens next, but what makes reading them so satisfying is that each volume also answers the question, why are these things happening? Each of the leading characters becomes more complex and rounded as the plot progresses. Characters we thought were old-fashioned heroes begin to show weakness, bad judgment, and even cruelty, while characters we hated from the start turn out to show flashes of tenderness and compassion. Conrad's plot in Lord Jim is the most complex of all these examples, and yet, oddly enough, it may be the most realistic of all of them. Chronological narratives seem lifelike because we seem to experience our lives in chronological order without knowing what's going to happen next. But while Conrad's method may not mimic the way Jim's life happens, it does mimic, in a very lifelike way, the manner in which most of us learn about the other people in our lives. Think about someone you've met as an adult and have gotten to know really well, your spouse perhaps, or a good friend, and then think about how you learned about them. Chances are, that person didn't sit down with you on your first meeting and tell you his or her whole life story in chronological order from birth. Rather, you got a vivid first impression, and then over days or weeks or years, the rest of that person's life was revealed to you in bits and pieces and out of chronological order. This is how the plot in Lord Jim works, and it results in a much more intense and intimate experience of the character. The reader is given the basic information about Jim's life, and then expected to assemble it in chronological order without any help from Jim, or for that matter, the author. Some readers, of course, won't want to put in the effort, and that's fine. But for those of us who do, we come to know the character of Jim as intimately as we would one of our best friends. The conclusion of Lord Jim is very powerful. Even though I've read it at least as many times as I've seen Die Hard, it never fails to shake me up. The final effect is not just, oh, so that's how it turned out, or take that, Voldemort, but a profound understanding of how a person's best qualities can sometimes lead to his ruin. Before I wrap this lecture up, I want to make clear that I'm not saying that simple storytelling is inferior and that complex, non-chronological modernist plotting is superior. One of my other favorite books, and one of the greatest novels ever written, is George Eliot's massive Victorian novel, Middlemarch. This book has a wonderful, complex plot with many strands, but it moves forward just as chronologically as Die Hard or Game of Thrones, only with a lot fewer explosions and beheadings. And I really, really love Die Hard. It's just that narratives like Die Hard's and narratives like Lord Jim's reach different regions of a reader's heart and brain, and they serve different functions for the writer. Now here's an exercise to help you explore the difference between a story and a plot. List all the major plot points of a story you admire or a story of your own, but write them out on index cards, one plot point to a card, in the order in which they actually appear in the story. If it's a narrative which is told out of chronological order, try putting the cards in chronological order and see how it changes the effect of the narrative. If it's a narrative that already moves chronologically, lay the cards out and see what happens if you start rearranging them. And if you want to be especially bold, just shuffle the cards and try retelling the story in whatever order they end up in. Deciding how to arrange the events of a narrative helps to determine what you want the reader to take away from it. In the next lecture, I'll explain the famous Freytag pyramid by using the Wizard of Oz as an example. And in the subsequent lectures about plot, I'll look at different types and techniques of plotting and give you some suggestions for making choices about just what kind of story you want to tell. Everybody thinks they know how to tell a joke. What that usually means in practice is that most of us understand, at least intuitively, the basic structure of the typical joke. You introduce a situation with a twist in it, the joke exploits the twist to build tension, and then the tension is released as a punchline, which usually involves a reversal of expectations. There are countless jokes that follow this structure, and depending on the content of the joke and the delivery of the joke teller, the amazing thing is that most people still find this sort of joke funny. It doesn't matter that the structure is simple and predictable. It doesn't matter that we know instinctively that the joke's going to end in a reversal. The fact is, when most of us hear the phrase, "a guy walks into a bar," our ears perk up. We know exactly what to expect. Situation, twist, punchline. You'd think this would prevent us from being surprised, and yet we also expect to laugh at the end of it. It's a very reliable, almost reflexive response. In fiction, the structure of the traditional plot works in much the same way, especially in popular fiction and very often in literary fiction as well. When we start reading a certain type of story, a mystery story, say, or a romance novel, we're given a particular situation we've seen many times before. A detective is called to the scene of a murder, or a young couple have a cute meeting. Then a conflict or a complication arises. The murdered body was found alone in a room that was locked from the inside, or the couple dislike each other intensely on first sight. Then the story or novel proceeds to work its way through the conflict. The detective searches for clues, interviews witnesses, and finds herself threatened by the murderer or someone who was protecting the murderer. The lovers circle each other warily as the rest of the plot revolves around them. Finally, the detective catches the murderer, or at least learns the murderer's identity, and the sparring lovers come to their senses, fall into each other's arms, and live happily ever after, as we always knew they would. This basic structure, situation, conflict, resolution, was first codified by the Greek philosopher Aristotle in his work The Poetics, in which he names and defines the various elements that make up a tragic drama. To this day, 2,300 years after his death, people still talk about a narrative having an Aristotelian structure. It's beyond the scope of this lecture for me to explain Aristotle's theory in detail, but suffice it to say that he was the first to state explicitly that a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. He was also the first to say that the events of the plot should be both causally connected and self-contained, and that the ending of the plot, and remember that he's talking specifically about tragedy here, should provide both closure and catharsis. Aristotle also introduces the concepts of the protagonist and the antagonist, or the two major characters who are in conflict with each other. But when we're talking about prose fiction these days, Freytag's pyramid is more commonly referred to than Aristotle. Freytag's pyramid is a graph of dramatic structure based on Aristotle's theory and created by an otherwise obscure 19th century German novelist and playwright named Gustav Freytag. This distinctive sketch of a pyramid, which is actually more of a triangle, has been a staple of literature and creative writing classes for years, and depending on who's explaining it, Freytag's pyramid is made up of either 5, 6, or 7 elements. For the sake of completeness, I'm going to explain the 7-element version. As the name suggests, these elements are usually graphed in the shape of a pyramid. Starting at ground level on the left-hand side of the pyramid and rising towards the top, the first 3 elements are the exposition, the inciting incident, and the rising action. At the peak of the pyramid is the climax, which is the moment of greatest emotion or drama. Then the pyramid descends on the right-hand side in the falling action, the resolution, and it ends at ground level again on the other side with the denouement. In order to show this pyramid in practice, I'm going to use a story everybody knows, namely the plot of the film version of The Wizard of Oz. The exposition stage of a story sets the scene and introduces the characters. In The Wizard of Oz, the exposition is everything that happens from the beginning of the film all the way up to the tornado. During this section, we meet Dorothy Gale, who lives on a farm in Kansas with her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, as well as the farmhands Hunk, Zeke, and Hickory. We also meet their mean neighbor, Miss Gulch, who has been bitten by Dorothy's dog, Toto, and who wants to have Toto put to sleep. As a result of this threat, Dorothy runs away with Toto and meets the medicine show pitchman, Professor Marvel. He sends her back to her family, but on her way back to the farm, Dorothy is overtaken by a storm. By the time we get to the tornado, at the end of the exposition, all the major characters have been introduced. Next comes the inciting action, which is the event that introduces conflict into the story. The inciting action of The Wizard of Oz is a bit ambiguous because there are two different elements in the story that might be called the conflict. One is the conflict between Dorothy on the one hand and Miss Gulch on the other, because Miss Gulch wants Dorothy's dog put to death. This is what causes Dorothy to run away from home, leading directly to her getting conked on the head during the tornado. In that sense, you might consider Miss Gulch's threat the inciting moment. But then this conflict becomes more complicated a few minutes later, when the tornado transports Dorothy to the land of Oz. There, Dorothy's house lands on the Wicked Witch of the East and kills her, and the witch's sister, the Wicked Witch of the West, threatens to kill Dorothy in revenge. However, this is really just the same conflict, because the Wicked Witch of the West is actually just Miss Gulch in her Oz incarnation, and in both incarnations she wants to harm Dorothy. In fact, using Aristotle's terminology, we now have a protagonist, Dorothy, and an antagonist, Miss Gulch, aka the Wicked Witch. But there's another conflict that arises after Dorothy lands in Oz. And that's the fact that she wants to go home and nobody knows how to send her back to Kansas. These two conflicts, Dorothy versus the Wicked Witch and Dorothy's quest to go home, are linked, of course, and they get linked even more explicitly later on. Let's just say that by the time Dorothy starts down the yellow brick road, the inciting incident has already happened. The rising action is the part where the plot gets more complicated and exciting, building tension along the way. Here's where you get twists and obstacles and digressions. As a result of these obstacles, in most stories, the rising action makes up the majority of the plot. In The Wizard of Oz, the rising action includes Dorothy's departure from Munchkinland and her meetings with the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, whom we've already met in the exposition as Hunk, Zeke, and Hickory. The rising action also includes her arrival in the Emerald City, her first audience with the Wizard of Oz, who is really, of course, Professor Marvel, and her capture by the Wicked Witch of the West. Along the way, obstacles are thrown in the path of Dorothy and her companions. During the scene where she and the Scarecrow discover the Tin Man, they are attacked by the talking trees, and the witch turns up to threaten them with a fireball. Then Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Man tame the Cowardly Lion after he attacks them, and after that, they survive the witch's attempt to put them all to sleep in the poppy field. During this part of the story, the two conflicts I mentioned earlier are re-emphasized. Once Dorothy and her companions arrive in the Emerald City, the Wicked Witch's rage at Dorothy is spelled out in the sky when she writes the words, "Surrender Dorothy," in smoke with her broomstick. Then Dorothy, trembling before the big flaming head of the wizard, asks for his help in sending her home. The two conflicts are then explicitly linked when the wizard tells Dorothy he'll help her get back to Kansas if she brings him the witch's broomstick. Dorothy and her companions then face their most difficult challenge, with Dorothy getting carried away by the flying monkeys in the haunted forest, and her companions breaking into the witch's castle to rescue her. All of these scenes, from Dorothy's arrival in Oz to the final showdown in the witch's castle, constitute the story's rising action, and they make up much of the running time of The Wizard of Oz. This brings us to the climax, which is the most dramatic and exciting event in the story. The climax of The Wizard of Oz comes when Dorothy and her friends are trapped in the witch's castle, and she kills the Wicked Witch by dousing her with a bucket of water. It's without a doubt the most heart-stopping moment in the film, no matter how many times you've seen it. And at that moment, much of the film's tension is released because at least one of the conflicts, the one between Dorothy and the witch, is ended, and the plot begins its descent down the other side of the pyramid. The next element is called the falling action, which is made up of the events that result directly from the moment of climax, and the element after that is called the resolution, where the main character's conflict is resolved. In a detective story, catching or revealing the killer is often the climax, after which there isn't much else to relate. In a romance, the lovers usually declare their love for each other only a few pages before the end of the novel, and just like in the detective story, not much happens after the climax. In The Wizard of Oz, after Dorothy has killed the Wicked Witch, she takes the witch's broomstick back to the wizard. Then the wizard, after a little persuading, solves the problems of the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion with something for each of them out of his big black bag. As for Dorothy, he agrees to take her back to Kansas himself. That's the falling action. It shows the results of the death of the witch, but it still hasn't resolved Dorothy's second conflict, the fact that she wants to go home to Kansas. That moment, the resolution, comes when the wizard accidentally takes off in his balloon without Dorothy, and Dorothy learns from Glinda the Good Witch that she could have taken herself back to Kansas at any time by using the ruby slippers. At this point, Dorothy's conflict is finally resolved. The threat from the witch is liquidated, so to speak, and she realizes she always had the power to go home. The denouement is the ending of the story, when order is restored. The word denouement is the French word for untying, which frankly seems a little counterintuitive to me. We usually talk about tying up the loose threads of a plot, but if you think of it as referring to untying the knot of the conflict, I suppose it makes sense. But at any rate, during the denouement, we are often shown all the major characters one more time so we can see what happened to them. In The Wizard of Oz, it's the final scene in Dorothy's bedroom, where she is reunited with Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, and also with the now suspiciously familiar farmhands. Even the Wizard of Oz himself returns in the final moments in the form of Professor Marvel. Miss Gulch is nowhere to be seen because, of course, she has been killed off in her incarnation as the Wicked Witch. In this final scene, both Dorothy and the narrative are literally returned home, back to where they both began. In some stories, this simply means that order has been restored and the world is now back to the way it was. But this isn't always the case, and it's certainly not the case in The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy is back home, where she wanted to be, but this is not to say that everything is back to the way it was before she went to Oz. Dorothy's understanding of herself and her place in the world has profoundly changed. After the strangeness and the violence she experienced in Oz, order has been restored, but she is a wiser and stronger person. Now, I've gone into so much detail about this particular structure because it's the sturdy, reliable, ubiquitous, and often predictable structure of countless books, stories, plays, movies, and television series. And predictability is not necessarily a bad thing. Predictability can be enormously reassuring and satisfying. I've seen The Wizard of Oz probably at least once a year for the last 50 years. The tornado never fails to thrill me, the witch never fails to terrify me, and Dorothy saying goodbye to the Scarecrow never fails to make me cry. The appeal of this simple, sturdy structure runs deep. Some people even think there's something instinctual about it, something hardwired in our consciousness that makes us want to see the world ordered into stories like these. The disadvantage of this traditional structure, however, is that it can also be a one-size-fits-all straitjacket. Think of the countless best-selling novels or blockbuster movies that are pretty much cut to the same pattern. With too many conventionally plotted novels, you can not only guess the ending after the first few pages, you can often guess it from the jacket copy before you even open the book. The publishing industry and Hollywood don't exactly help the situation by turning out books and movies that are carbon copies of earlier books and movies that have done well. But we as readers bear some of the blame by rewarding the predictable and the reassuring, and by making it harder for more offbeat forms of storytelling to succeed. Sometimes you feel both reassured and annoyed at the same story. You may have guessed during the first 10 pages that the sparring lovers are eventually going to get together. But imagine how disappointed and annoyed you would be if it turns out at the end that they don't really like each other after all, and they wind up with other people. Or worse, they wind up alone. The predictable can be both disappointing and seductive at the same time. Even so, this particular narrative structure has proved to be surprisingly adaptable, considering that when first Aristotle and then, centuries later, Gustav Freytag outlined it, they were thinking only of stage tragedies. Plays, obviously, have a limited running time, and because of that limited running time, a limited number of scenes and characters. The plays Aristotle was familiar with, in fact, usually focused on the fate of a single central character, such as Oedipus or Medea, or some other character from Greek history or mythology. He had never seen a novel, and certainly not a novel that works on an epic scale and incorporates lots of characters, more characters than you can fit into most plays. And yet the Aristotelian structure can be applied to everything from comedy to tragedy, from thrillers to love stories, from Hamlet to the X-Men. And for writers who are just starting out, Freytag's pyramid can serve as a set of training wheels, especially if you're uneasy about plotting. It's so common in our culture, in fact, that many writers adopt it instinctively, without really thinking about it. My own first novel, The Wild Colonial Boy, can easily be graphed on Freytag's pyramid, and yet at the time I was writing it, I had never heard of Freytag's pyramid. I was just feeling my way through the story organically, or so I thought. The fact that my book can easily be plotted along the pyramid is just proof of how deeply ingrained in our culture it is, as if it actually were something natural and instinctive. Freytag's pyramid seems so instinctive and ubiquitous because, in its simplest form, it is often the foundation for what I'm going to call a binary plot. I'm going to talk in more detail about binary plots in lectures 13 and 14, when I talk about how to start and how to end a narrative. But for now, I'll just say that a binary plot is one in which an either-or question is posed near the start of the narrative, and then answered at the climax or resolution of the narrative. Who is the murderer? Will the two lovers ever get together? Will Dorothy ever get back to Kansas? There are all sorts of ways to complicate the answers to those questions, which I'll explore in the later lectures. But while we're talking about the traditional plot as a whole, I want to emphasize that there are ways to complicate this kind of plot long before you ever get to the end. A binary plot structured according to Freytag's pyramid doesn't have to be a simplistic or unsophisticated one. For one thing, you can scale up the story to take in a lot more time and many more characters than Aristotle or Freytag had in mind. You can do this by weaving together several binary plots or Freytag pyramids into one larger narrative. Take the great 19th century novel Middlemarch, for example, by the writer Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pen name George Eliot. It does have a main character. Dorothea Brooke is a beautiful, intellectual, and naively idealistic young woman. And it has a central plot line. Dorothea enters into a marriage with a much older religious scholar named Casaubon because she admires his intellect and his moral character. The marriage, predictably, is a disaster because Casaubon is a mediocre scholar and a passionless husband. It also fails because Dorothea is attracted to an intense young man her own age named Will Ladislaw. This love triangle is the central story of Middlemarch, but it takes up no more than a third of the book. There are two other major romantic relationships in the book. These include another unhappy marriage between an ambitious young doctor named Lydgate and a beautiful but shallow young woman named Rosamund, and a budding romance between Rosamund's charming but unreliable brother Fred and an earnest young woman named Mary. There's nothing unconventional or avant-garde about Middlemarch. Instead, it convincingly demonstrates that a conventionally plotted novel can still be sophisticated and true to life. Dorothea's story is plainly the narrative spine of the book, with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. But her story is enriched and complicated by all the other plot lines, each of which has a similar structure. Apart from a few flashbacks, all these plot lines move forward chronologically, but they are threaded together and interlinked, and in many cases, the events in one plotline have an effect on the others. The result is that it would be impossible to plot all of Middlemarch on only one Freytag's pyramid. Instead of one main story, we have several, all woven together, each one with its own conflict, rising action, and resolution. There's another way you can complicate a traditional plot, which I'm going to call the fractal plot. A fractal is a kind of mathematical pattern which is self-similar, which means that the pattern as a whole looks the same at a distance as it does up close in detail. Fractals often appear in nature. Trees are an excellent example. The limbs of a tree coming off the trunk make the same basic pattern as the branches coming off each limb, and the twigs make the same pattern coming off each branch, and so on. You can even take it down to the level of individual leaves, where the veins spread across each leaf, like the pattern of branches. The point is, no matter whether you look at the tree from across a field or peer very close up at a single leaf, you're always going to see essentially the same branching pattern. That's a fractal. You can create the same effect with large-scale narratives in novels that run in series, such as George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a single binary question posed by Martin's books. Who will sit on the Iron Throne and be the king or queen of Westeros? But because the books involve so many rival factions and so many individual characters, this larger binary plot is made up of a huge number of smaller but no less compelling binary plots at nearly every level. Just below the level of the main binary question are several largest questions. Will the Starks defeat the Lannisters? Will the Night's Watch keep the White Walkers north of the Wall? Will Daenerys Targaryen bring her dragons back to Westeros? These separate plot lines play out over the course of several books. Below that level are binary questions that play out over the course of a single book. For example, will Brienne of Tarth deliver Jaime Lannister to King's Landing? These single-volume plot lines usually involve the fate of a single character or pair of characters. Within each book, each individual chapter can also be plotted out as a little Freytag pyramid. In each chapter, the point of view character, whether it's Tyrion Lannister or Arya Stark or Daenerys Targaryen, is usually faced with a problem at the beginning of the chapter, which is resolved or complicated by the end of the chapter. Obviously, these little pyramids are not as complex or detailed as the overarching one that describes the whole narrative. For example, with many of the chapters, you already know the characters and the setting, so Martin can dispense with exposition. But even so, Martin's narrative uses a traditional narrative pyramid: situation, conflict, climax, resolution, at every level. There's one overarching pyramid that governs the whole story, but it's made up of lots of smaller pyramids. The plot of A Song of Ice and Fire is a fractal, in other words. You can see the same pattern at every level, whether it's the whole series, an individual book, or an individual chapter. It's pyramids all the way down. If you've ever wondered, as I have, how Martin keeps all these plot lines and characters and all that backstory straight, I think this structure may be the key to it. By breaking the larger story down into smaller pieces and breaking those pieces into even smaller pieces, it's possible for him to move ahead with a really huge narrative without getting lost or discouraged. Now, for those of us who aren't planning to write a narrative that runs for 10,000 pages, there are other ways you can run interesting variations on the Freytag pyramid that don't involve keeping track of hundreds of characters. For example, you can create something I'll call a leapfrogging or contrapuntal narrative. There's a lot of variations to this, but I'll limit it to 4. The first is a narrative that tells a single story, but tells it from the points of view of multiple characters, each one taking a turn before handing the story off to another character. Perhaps the most famous example of this is William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying. This book tells the story of the Bundrens, a family of Mississippi farmers, and how they cope with the death of the family's mother, Addie. Before she died, Addie made her husband, Ance, promise that he'd bury her in the town of Jefferson, which is an inconvenient distance away. The novel is a blackly comic account of how the family carries her coffin all the way to town. He could have told the story in a straightforward fashion with a third-person narration, but instead, Faulkner decided to narrate the entire novel from the points of view of 15 different characters. Each character speaks in the first person, trading off with the other members of the family, as well as with people they meet along the way. It's a technically adventurous book, but it tells an old-fashioned story, one that includes all the elements of the Freytag pyramid. The difference is that each piece of the story is told by a different character. Another type of leapfrogging or contrapuntal narrative you could try is the one that tells several equally important stories that remain separate for much of the book, but which come together at the end for a single climax. In fact, A Song of Ice and Fire is a crazily complex version of this type of narrative, but let's look at a slightly simpler version. There's no more old-fashioned a storyteller than J.R.R. Tolkien, and his masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, builds to one of the biggest climaxes in the history of literature, namely the eruption of Mount Doom in the third volume of the trilogy, The Return of the King. But if you look at how he gets there, Tolkien is a surprisingly adventurous plotter. By the end of the first volume, The Fellowship of the Ring, the story essentially splits into three equally important strands. You have the story of Frodo, Sam, and Gollum making their way to Mordor. You have the story of Merry and Pippin's kidnapping by the orcs. And you have the story of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli as they search for Merry and Pippin. Again, there's an overarching story here, namely the quest to destroy the One Ring. You also have a single overarching chronology. But while you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you're shifting back and forth among the three stories, which take place at vast distances from each other, even if they take place at the same time. If you outline the whole story, taking into account all of its various branches, you'll see a lot of smaller Freytag pyramids, the way you would with A Song of Ice and Fire. Let me recommend two more styles of contrapuntal narrative. One is commonly used by modern historical novelists. The old-fashioned historical novel focuses exclusively on a period or an episode in the past, but a number of contemporary historical novels weave two main stories together, usually a story from the past and a story from the present, which are linked somehow. A great example is A.S. Byatt's novel Possession. The historical half of the novel is about a passionate love affair between two Victorian poets, and the contemporary half is about a group of modern academics who are competing with each other to find out the truth about this long-rumored affair. It's fundamentally an old-fashioned plot, and it builds to a very spooky climax in a graveyard at night. It's made up of two equal plot lines which feature characters who can never meet with each other because they live in different centuries. And yet the outcome of one plot determines the outcome of the other. There are other parallelisms as well. The pair of lovers in the 19th century are matched by a pair of lovers among the competing academics in the 20th century, for example. And there's one more type of leapfrogging narrative. As I've said before, the basic murder mystery is usually a contrapuntal story. It's the most basic kind of binary plot there is: who killed the victim? But the answer is often arrived at in a complicated way. There's the present-day story, which usually starts with the discovery of the body and follows the progress of the investigation. And then there's the story of the recent past, which ends with the murder. Looked at chronologically, one story, that of the murder, ends just as the other story, that of the investigation, begins. But the way most murder mysteries are structured, you start with the investigation and work backwards into the story of the murder, learning it in bits and pieces, and often out of chronological order. Nobody would call most murder mysteries avant-garde, but even the most run-of-the-mill of them does interesting things with plot and chronology. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk some more about the traditional plot, taking a look at ways you can rearrange or adapt the individual pieces of it, plus some other common techniques you can use to make the plot more complex and intriguing. We'll be looking at examples from Shirley Jackson, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and Flannery O'Connor. And in the lecture after that, I'll talk about the plotless or non-traditional narrative. These narratives work outside the lines of the Freytag pyramid, but each one nevertheless has a structure. Every work of fiction has a structure, even if it doesn't have a plot. In the meantime, I'll leave you with a very simple but very fruitful exercise. Take some of your favorite books or movies or television shows and see if you can graph them on Freytag's pyramid. I think you'll find a couple of interesting things. One is how common a structure it is, but you'll also find how often the structure of a narrative is not a single pyramid, but a more complicated tangle of many pyramids, like the structures of As I Lay Dying, or Middlemarch, or A Song of Ice and Fire. If you don't want a traditionally structured plot to become a straitjacket, you need to walk a fine line between being too predictable on the one hand and disappointing the reader on the other. You want the reader to be satisfied and not feel betrayed by your climax, but on the other hand, you don't want them to see it coming. This particular structure has survived for a couple thousand years, partly because it can be reassuring. But it has also survived because it has turned out to be remarkably adaptable and capable of being bent into all sorts of interesting shapes without breaking. In my first lecture on plot, I talked about the difference between story and plot. In the second lecture, I explained that many narratives have the same basic Aristotelian structure of situation, conflict, and resolution. This structure is also known as Freytag's pyramid, with its separate stages of exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, and denouement. I also said that you can play interesting variations on this basic plot structure that makes plotting both interesting and challenging. The underlying story in Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim fits Freytag's pyramid fairly well if you lay it out chronologically. But the way Conrad rearranges that chronology helps make Lord Jim one of the greatest novels ever written. And even if a narrative moves forward more or less chronologically, the way Middlemarch and A Song of Ice and Fire do, you can still complicate and enrich the plot by braiding together several stories or plot lines, or by leapfrogging separate narratives so that they come together in the end. So far, I've been talking about the structure of a narrative as a whole, but in this lecture, I want to talk about techniques that you can use on a smaller scale to make a plot more subtle and satisfying. These include suspense, flash forwards, flashbacks, and foreshadowing. But before I get started, I want to introduce a sweeping generalization that may make plotting seem less daunting to you. As I've said earlier, John Gardner wrote that plotting is one of the hardest things a writer does. I know from my own experience that many talented writers are more often intimidated by the idea of constructing a plot than they are by any other facet of fiction writing. And what often intimidates them is not that they don't know how to get started or what they want to say, but that they have so much they want to get across that they're worried about bogging the narrative down. So, here's my sweeping pronouncement. One of the fundamental principles of plotting is the withholding of information. At the beginning of a plot, you want the reader to know very little. But at the end, you want the reader to know everything. You might even say this is the essence of every plot that ever existed. A plot is the mechanism by which the writer decides what information to withhold, what information to reveal, and in what order. In many instances, the writer himself doesn't know as he starts how a story is going to turn out, but he certainly knows by the time he's finished writing it. A couple of lectures ago, I said that my high school English teacher, Mrs. Giltner, defined literature as the creation of order out of chaos. And way back in my lecture about evocation, I said that fiction suggests reality by choosing the most evocative details rather than trying to include every single detail about a character, a setting, or a situation. If writing fiction was just a matter of recording all the facts as they happen, then trial transcripts and surveillance videos would be the greatest works of art ever made. But in fiction, We're trying to create meaning out of this relentless stream of events, so you have to choose what to keep, what to leave out, and what order you put them in. Since all books and stories are read over time and can't be imbibed all at once, the most fundamental thing a writer withholds from the reader is how the story ends. In the simplest kind of stories, the ones that E.M. Forster said only answer the question, "and then?" This is the main reason to keep reading, to find out how it all turns out. But there are other kinds of withholding that result in more subtle plots. Take, for example, Shirley Jackson's famous story, The Lottery. Most American high school students have read this story at least once. It's about a small New England village which, once a year, for reasons that are never explained in the story, holds a lottery for all the adults in the village. The person who wins the lottery, so to speak, is stoned to death by all the others. Assuming you've read it before and I haven't just ruined the ending for you, you will remember what a shock it is to read this story for the first time. I was introduced to it in a high school English class, where the teacher had us all read it silently to ourselves, and you could tell when each reader got what was happening in the story by the separate little gasps all around the room. It's a beautifully crafted story on a lot of levels, but the main reason it works is that the author introduces the concept of the lottery in the very first paragraph, but she withholds from the reader what the lottery is actually for. What makes reading The Lottery especially gut-wrenching on a first reading is that the reader is the only person who doesn't know what's going on. The author certainly does, as do all the characters in the story. The story lulls you with its measured, uninflected evocation of the life of a seemingly normal country town, and then it springs the horror on you at the end. This kind of withholding puts the reader in a very lonely place. It's as if you're standing in a group of people you've known all your life, and you suddenly wake up to the fact that they're capable of killing you in cold blood. There's one other thing I want to point out about Jackson's withholding of information in The Lottery. This technique is not the same thing as an unreliable narrator, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. The narration of The Lottery is reliable. Everything the story tells us is true. It never misrepresents anything. It's just that the story withholds the single most important fact. That's a pretty simple kind of withholding, the surprise ending. And yet another kind of withholding is the creation of suspense. In a story that involves a surprise, the writer withholds information from the reader and sometimes from the characters. In a story that creates suspense, the writer withholds information from the characters but lets the reader in on the secret. Perhaps the most famous explanation of the difference between surprise and suspense comes from the great English film director Alfred Hitchcock. In the mid-1960s, he gave a famous series of interviews to the French director François Truffaut. Hitchcock used the example of placing a ticking bomb under a table while two characters are talking. If you don't show the audience the bomb, then they will be as surprised as the characters are when it goes off. This, Hitchcock said, can be a very satisfying effect. In fact, one of Hitchcock's most famous sequences, the shower scene in Psycho, is exactly that sort of surprise. But Hitchcock also says in the interview that he prefers suspense to surprise. In order to make the same situation suspenseful, two people talking while a bomb ticks down under the table, all you have to do is show the audience the bomb at the start of the scene without showing it to the characters. The result is that the audience feels anxious on behalf of the characters, who continue their conversation with no inkling of the danger they're in. As Hitchcock himself put it, in the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of the explosion. In the second case, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense. There are other kinds of withholding that have to do with the rearranging of the elements of the traditional plot. These techniques are perhaps not so much about withholding information as they are simply about presenting it to the reader in an unusual order. Let's take exposition as an example. As John Gardner points out in The Art of Fiction, exposition can take place at any point in the narrative. In fact, in most cases, you want to save a good deal of your exposition for later. At the beginning of a narrative, you want to explain enough to intrigue the reader and keep her reading, but you don't want to explain too much. There are some exceptions to this practice. Writers of science fiction or historical fiction sometimes include a passage or a chapter at the beginning of a narrative in which they tell the reader everything she needs to know about the world of the story. This sort of exposition has an unlovely name, the info dump. These chapters can occasionally be tedious to read, even if they are the most efficient way of explaining a complicated world so that the writer can get the story going. On the other hand, most mainstream writers, and a lot of science fiction authors and historical novelists, prefer to provide exposition as needed and only then. If you manage to sneak the exposition in without the reader noticing that it's exposition, it can feel more natural than dropping it all on the reader's doorstep at once. In many cases, you can introduce exposition seamlessly by providing the information to the reader at the same time as the characters are learning it. Much of the traditional mystery novel, for example, consists of backstory and exposition, which gets parceled out in small doses. It would spoil the mystery to provide all the exposition at the start, because that would require saying who the murderer is. Instead, the reader helps to solve the mystery alongside the detective. Indeed, it's the withholding of backstory and exposition that makes a mystery novel a mystery novel. Or consider the inciting action, which you may recall is the moment that conflict is introduced into a story and gets the plot going. In popular fiction, the inciting action often comes at the very beginning, even before the exposition. A good example is the opening of the movie Jaws. The very first thing that happens in the movie is that a young woman at a party goes for a midnight swim on the beach and gets eaten by a shark. Only then are we introduced to Chief Brody, the first of three main characters, and only after we meet Chief Brody are we introduced to the island community of Amity. And later on, when the rising action of the story is well underway, we are introduced to the other two main characters, Hooper, the young marine biologist, and Quint, the grizzled old fisherman. In other words, we get the inciting incident in the first 5 minutes, then we get the exposition, and we don't even meet the third major character until halfway through the film. All the traditional elements of Freytag's pyramid are there, but in a different order. In fact, you can even structure a story so that you give away the climax in the first few moments. In other words, you put the climax ahead of everything else. The novel Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin is structured this way. Giovanni's Room is the story of a young American named David who was living in Paris in the early 1950s and wrestling with his own sexuality. As a teenager, he had a sexual relationship with another boy, but he resists thinking of himself as gay. In fact, in the years since, he has gotten involved with a young woman. Meanwhile, living in Paris, he falls in love with another man, an Italian named Giovanni, who works as a bartender in a place owned by a Frenchman named Guillaume. Without going into all the details, suffice it to say that Giovanni ends up murdering Guillaume, that he is sentenced to death by guillotine, and that David feels responsible for Giovanni's fate. The novel is told in the first person by David. Recalling Forster's distinction between story and plot, please note that the story of Giovanni's Room starts chronologically years before, with David recalling his childhood and teenage years in flashback. The plot, however, starts on the evening before Giovanni's execution, which is nearly the end of the story. By page 2, we know that David and Giovanni had been lovers, and by page 3, we know that Giovanni is going to be executed the following morning. So after only 3 pages, we know that David and Giovanni had an affair, that it led to disaster, and that David is racked with guilt over it. If you lay out the events of this story in chronological order, as opposed to its structure as a plot, it looks like a Freytag pyramid. But instead of following that structure, Baldwin very shrewdly gives us the most dramatic element right from the start, namely the upcoming execution. This has the effect of intriguing the reader, making him want to know exactly how things turned out so badly. In fact, Baldwin does an even more interesting thing later on. Even though he opens the novel by telling us that Giovanni is going to be executed, he never actually shows us the climax. The night before the execution, David is miles away from the prison in a house in the French countryside. Having promised that he would be present for the execution, David loses his nerve and refuses to go to the prison. In the last few pages of the book, he imagines what Giovanni's execution is like, but he doesn't actually witness it. The resolution of the plot on the very last page is David's descent into guilt, self-doubt, and self-recrimination. It might seem that Baldwin isn't actually withholding anything in Giovanni's room. After all, he's giving away the ending in the first 3 pages. But I think he's actually engaging in a more subtle kind of withholding. That is, he's withholding the full effect and meaning of Giovanni's impending death on David, which we don't really understand until the book's final pages. If you look at it as a conventional binary plot, will David and Giovanni find happiness together, the book blows it in the first chapter. But if you look at it as a more subtle kind of binary narrative, will David accept his share of responsibility for Giovanni's predicament, the novel works wonderfully well. As much as I love The Lottery and the films of Alfred Hitchcock, their kind of withholding is more mechanical than what Baldwin is doing in Giovanni's room. In The Lottery, Shirley Jackson withholds what happens at the climax, while in Giovanni's room, Baldwin withholds why the climax happens. In each case, the reader is compelled by the writer to read the whole narrative to get to the truth. In fact, what Baldwin is doing in the opening of Giovanni's room is an especially extreme example of a flash forward. As the name implies, a flash forward is the opposite of a flashback. Both flash forwards and flashbacks are scenes that take place out of the main chronological order of the story. A flash forward is a glimpse of something that will happen to the characters in the future, at the end of, and perhaps even after, the main narrative, while a flashback is a scene that usually takes place before the main plotline started. Flash forwards are often used in first-person narratives. The narrator gives the reader a glimpse of an intriguing or dire outcome, as in Giovanni's room, and then returns to the beginning and shows how the story worked its way up to that point. Another famous first-person flash forward is the beginning of Billy Wilder's great film about Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard. This film opens with the narrator, a screenwriter named Joe Gillis, starting to tell his story from beyond the grave as we see his dead body floating in a swimming pool. The rest of the film then backs up and shows us how he ended up in the drink. But flash forwards don't necessarily have to appear only at the beginning of a plot. In fact, using a flash forward as a kind of teaser to hook the reader can occasionally come across as a rather mechanical effect. Remember that you can use a flash forward anywhere in a narrative. You can even do it at the end, when it's rather like fast-forwarding a video, skipping the intervening time to show how the characters turn out years after the main chronology of the story. A very effective example is Alice Munro's long short story, The Beggar Maid. This story is about Rose, a young working-class woman from a small Ontario town, who goes away to college, where she is courted by Patrick, an awkward young man from Vancouver who happens to be the heir to a fortune. It's a 33-page story, and the first 30 pages take place more or less chronologically, showing the awkward courtship of Rose and Patrick over the course of a year or two. The last 4 pages of the story fast forward through their disastrous marriage and acrimonious divorce. The story ends in a final scene years later when they simply glance at each other in passing in the Toronto airport, and Rose realizes for the first time just how much Patrick despises her. Power of that devastating final scene comes, in part, from everything we know of their cumulative history. But the scene's power is also partly a product of that giant leap in chronology, showing us how 2 characters who have not met in years can still feel instantaneous rage at the sight of the other. Flashbacks, of course, are much more common. As I said a few minutes ago, detective stories tend to be made up mostly of flashbacks, as the detective or investigator hears from witnesses about the situation that led up to the murder. But flashbacks can also be used to great effect in other genres or in mainstream fiction. For one thing, flashbacks can be used as replacements for, or in combination with, exposition. They are especially useful when you're trying to present the reader with necessary information about the previous history of a character. Flashbacks are often used in preference to a simple piece of exposition if the information about the character is particularly important or dramatic. For example, early in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, a young girl named Denver recalls what her mother told her about the circumstances of Denver's birth. To put it simply, Denver's mother, Setha, was an escaped slave on the run when she gave birth to Denver in a patch of wild onions on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, just across the river from freedom. It's an important piece of information about Denver's past and about Setha's struggle to be free. Morrison could easily have taken care of it in a brief expository summary, but instead, she has Denver remember her mother telling her the story of her own birth. This then segues effortlessly into a third-person account of the birth itself, showing it in graphic and powerful detail. By using a dramatic flashback instead of a simple expository description, Morrison is emphasizing how important this episode is in the lives of Setha and her daughter, and how important it is to the rest of the plot. The main narrative of Beloved takes place in the years after the Civil War, but many of the scenes are flashbacks to the lives of its main characters before the war, when they were still slaves. Much of the power of the book comes from showing us how the past haunts the present, and that effect comes in large part from Morrison's frequent and skillful use of flashbacks. This brings me now to foreshadowing, which is not the same thing as a flash forward. A flash forward is a fully evoked and dramatized scene set in the future, but foreshadowing is a hint or a series of hints that a writer plants early in the narrative in order to prepare the way for what comes later. In many instances, the success of a narrative's resolution depends on how carefully the writer has prepared the way. Simply put, you want the resolution to be unpredictable but satisfying, and pulling that off requires a balance between withholding information so that the reader can't predict what's going to happen, and revealing just enough information so that the reader doesn't feel cheated when the ending is revealed. In other words, you want the end of the story to feel both surprising but inevitable. The response you want from the reader is, at the same moment, "Oh my God," and "Of course." You want the reader to think, "I should have seen that coming," but without actually allowing her to see it coming. This is where foreshadowing comes in. Some of it is fairly mechanical. You want to make sure that you introduce all the characters, the context, and even the props that you need for a story to pay off. We've all felt cheated by stories or movies where the writer or filmmaker pulls something out of his hat at the last moment to make the ending work. But we've all also experienced narratives where everything suddenly and very satisfyingly makes sense, and all the pieces of the narrative click into place. On a number of occasions, and in a number of different ways, the Russian playwright and short story writer Anton Chekhov famously said that if you show the audience a pistol on the wall in the first act, then that pistol has to go off in the third act. This has been quoted so often that it has become a cliché. But like many clichés about writing, it's fundamentally true, and it is indeed a fundamental insight about creating a plot. Part of what Chekhov means is simply that you have to play fair with the audience or the reader. You can't have a character suddenly waving a pistol around without giving us some hint early on that waving a pistol around was at least a possibility. But he's also saying that you need to pay attention to what details you include and when you include them. If you show a pistol on the wall and nobody uses it, you set up an expectation in the reader and then thwarted it. Unless, of course, you intended it as a red herring, which is basically an act of false foreshadowing. But if that's not the case, then showing us the pistol and then never having it turn up again is just as bad as producing a pistol out of thin air. Chekhov's rule about the pistol has an even deeper meaning, though, which lies in its implicit reminder that a plot is not like real life. In our ordinary lives, we see countless details pass before us every day. Peoples, things, the weather, the news, all of it. In real life, we have to decide on the fly, usually subconsciously, what's important and what's not. But a narrative, as I keep reminding you, is not like real life. Every detail has a meaning. Every detail has been placed there by the writer for a specific purpose. And as the writer, you have to think about what details are important, what details you can ignore or leave out, and in what order you introduce them. That is what foreshadowing is all about. Let's look at two examples. The first comes from Flannery O'Connor's famous short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is one of the most unsettling stories in American fiction. It's about a Southern family who take off on a fateful road trip to Florida. The story is told mostly, though not entirely, from the point of view of the family's unnamed grandmother. The very first line is, "The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida." In the same paragraph, she tries to talk her son Bailey out of going by pointing out a story she's just read in the newspaper. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with her hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to those people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Now, spoiler alert, the grandmother and her family take off for Florida anyway, and along the way they do indeed run into the Misfit. Things do not go well. The first time you read this story, if nobody has given away the ending the way I just did, this little episode in the very first paragraph comes across as nothing more than gentle family comedy. All O'Connor seems to be doing is evoking an old woman's groundless paranoia, her clumsy attempt to manipulate her son, and her son's taciturn refusal to be manipulated. Indeed, until the Misfit himself turns up about 2/3 of the way into the story, A Good Man is Hard to Find is basically a comic account of the family's road trip, complete with bickering children and a colorful episode at a barbecue shack. It isn't until the final few pages, when the story closes around your heart like a steel trap, that you realize how efficiently detailed and tightly constructed it is. Without that bit of foreshadowing in the first paragraph, the story simply wouldn't have the same effect. At the beginning of A Good Man is Hard to Find, O'Connor hides a bit of menace that we don't even realize is menace until it's too late to avoid it. Let's take another, less spoilerish example. Joseph Conrad's Nostromo is an epic novel about a revolution in a fictional South American country called Costaguana. The main economic asset of Costaguana is a silver mine owned by an Englishman named Charles Gould. In the days before the revolution, Gould decides to hide his entire stockpile of silver so that the revolutionaries can't get their hands on it. To do this, he puts the silver on a barge, which he entrusts to an Italian sailor named Nostromo and a young journalist named Martin Decoud. These two men take the silver to an island off the coast of Costaguana to keep it safe from the rebels. Nostromo is a big, complicated novel with many characters, and like Lord Jim, it has a fractured chronology, but that's the central episode in the book. The silver is a metaphor not only for Gould's power as a colonialist, it's also a symbol for the corruptibility of human beings. The title character, Nostromo, is admired above all for his reliability and trustworthiness, and in the end, the effect the silver has on him becomes the central moral dilemma of the book. Now, the opening chapter of Nostromo is a masterpiece of exposition, consisting mainly of a long, evocative description of this fictional country's geography. But starting in the third paragraph, Conrad tells us a local legend about two foreigners, whom he identifies as Americanos perhaps, but gringos of some sort for certain. Many years ago, they ventured legendary buried gold and were never heard from again. Their story goes on for 2 more paragraphs, ending with this. The two gringos, spectral and alive, are believed to be dwelling to this day among the rocks under the fatal spell of their success. Their souls cannot tear themselves away from their bodies mounting guard over the discovered treasure. They are now rich and hungry and thirsty, a strange theory of tenacious gringo ghosts suffering in their starved and parched flesh of defiant heretics, where a Christian would have renounced and been released. Now, the first time you read Nostromo, this reads as if it's just a bit of folklore, thrown in by Conrad for local color and nothing more. It isn't until you read the novel a second or third time that you realize that this episode, which is only a couple hundred words or so, is a foreshadowing of the entire story. Specifically, it foreshadows the fates of Nostromo and Decoud. After depositing the silver on an island off the coast of Costaguana, Nostromo swims back to shore, leaving Decoud behind with the silver. While Nostromo becomes a hero by helping to defeat the revolution, Decoud, all alone on the lonely island, succumbs to despair. Finally, he rows out to sea, weighs his body down with 2 ingots of silver, and shoots himself. Nostromo returns too late and finds that Decoud is gone and probably dead. Because he believes he isn't getting as much credit for his heroism as he deserves, Nostromo tells everyone that the silver was lost at sea. Then, for the rest of his life, he slowly gets rich off the treasure by retrieving it one ingot at a time. At the end of the book, in a rather melodramatic turn of events, he loses his life because of the silver. So you can see that, by the end of the novel, the brief story of the Americans who haunt a missing treasure in the first chapter has happened again, in much more detail, with Decoud and Nostromo. Just like the two gringos, they experience both a spiritual and physical death because of treasure. This is an expert bit of foreshadowing, giving us not only the plot in a nutshell, but the novel's central theme. Even if you never read the novel more than once, this story registers in your subconscious and helps to prepare the way for the more complicated version that comes later on. In this lecture, we've only scratched the surface of the variations you can play on the traditional plot. There are many, many more ways to vary a traditional plot than I've got time to explore here. But as I've said, while the traditional plot is very sturdy and adaptable, it's not the only way to structure a narrative. In the next lecture, I'm going to do a brisk trot through the Epiphany short story and the modernist and postmodernist novel to show you some other ways that writers have structured fiction. We'll be looking specifically at Anton Chekhov's short story The Kiss, James Joyce's story The Dead, and Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. In the meantime, here's a simple exercise to explore one of the techniques I talked about in this lecture. Take a particular situation and tell it first as a surprise. Then take the same situation and retell it as a passage of suspense. If you want to use a ticking bomb, have at it, but it doesn't have to be violent. In fact, it can be a ticking bomb equivalent. Take the story I concocted for the first lecture about Sarah and Brad. In the surprise version, you might tell it from Brad's point of view, in which case Sarah's announcement that she wants a divorce is as much a surprise to the reader as it is to Brad. But you might also tell it from Sarah's point of view, in which case the reader would know from the start that she wants a divorce. Then the scene becomes one of suspense, as we wait anxiously for Brad to learn the truth. Give it a try. You might have some fun with it. Every work of fiction has a structure, but not every work of fiction has a plot. At least not a traditional plot like the ones I've been talking about in the last two lectures. But even if it doesn't have a plot, every work of fiction has to have something the writer John Gardner called profluence. Gardner defined profluence as the feeling that you're getting somewhere when you're reading a work of fiction. Let me suggest another way to think about it. Whether or not a story or a novel has a plot, something should change over the course of reading it, if not in the story itself, at least in the heart or mind of the reader. In this lecture, I want to suggest a few ways to structure fiction that don't involve using Freytag's pyramid or the traditional plot. I'll use some examples that don't raise the usual expectations, or that raise the reader's expectations and then confound them in a profound and subtle way. Let's start with short fiction. The short stories of the 19th century were generally plot-driven. Even though many of them were not quite long enough to accommodate all the features of Freytag's pyramid, they usually set up a situation, invoked a conflict, and resolved it pretty quickly, often with a twist at the end. Think of all the stories you might have read in high school. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, Guy de Maupassant's The Necklace, O. Henry's The Gift of the Magi, and nearly all of Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. Each one of these stories has a sting in its tail, as a secret is revealed or a twist is administered. Some of them, such as Young Goodman Brown and Benito Cereno, are quite profound, but compared to the modern short story, their effect is still pretty mechanical. This kind of story can be very satisfying, but it often doesn't quite feel like real life. The modern short story begins in the late 19th century with the Russian writer Anton Chekhov. He is perhaps better known as the author of such plays as The Cherry Orchard, Three Sisters, and Uncle Vanya. But among fiction writers, he is one of the most influential short story writers of all time. One of the most vivid reading experiences of my life, in fact, was reading his story The Kiss as a sophomore in college. It was a revelation to me at the time, because not only did it show me something profound about life, it showed me a whole new way of storytelling. What happens in The Kiss is very simple. The officers of an artillery regiment training in the Russian countryside are invited by a local landowner to spend the evening at his country house. During the course of the festivities, the main character, a very shy and buttoned-up officer named Ryabovich, wanders off by himself through the house. At one point, he walks into a completely darkened room. As he hesitates just inside the door, a woman rushes out of the dark, murmurs, "At last," and kisses him. An instant later, this woman realizes he isn't the man she was waiting for, and she flees the room, leaving the stunned Ryabovich in the dark. He steps into the lighted room where the party is going on and searches the faces of the women, but he never does discover who kissed him. Ryabovich and his regiment ride away the next morning. Up until now, his life has been utterly without passion, and for days afterwards, Ryabovich constantly fantasizes about this encounter. He even invents a whole future life, including marriage and children, with a woman whose name and face he doesn't even know. This is the most remarkable thing that has ever happened to him, and he spends the next few pages ringing like a bell that has been struck for the very first time. But at the end of the story, when his regiment returns to the same town, he loses his nerve as they pass the landowner's mansion. And when the landowner invites the officers back to his house that evening, Ryabovich stays behind in the barracks. And that's it. That's all that happens in the story. Scene by scene and sentence by sentence, it reads like a conventional story, full of vivid exposition, some sharply etched characters, and a fair amount of dry humor. The scenes are steadily laid out in chronological order, with no flashbacks or flash forwards. And yet, the story does not come to a climax or resolve like a traditional story. Ryabovich does not develop as a character. He does not win or lose at the end. He's the same person all the way through the story. He has a brief glimpse of a more exciting life, but his only response is in his lonely imagination, and he does nothing about it. He was a gray little man at the beginning of the story, he's a gray little man at the end, and he will be, Chekhov implies, a gray little man for the rest of his life. And even though the story does not resolve in the traditional way, this realization about Ryabovich has a very powerful effect on the reader. If you really wanted to, I suppose you could plot The Kiss on a Freytag pyramid. It opens with exposition, the description of Ryabovich and his regiment. It has an inciting action, the kiss in the dark. It has a rising action, Ryabovich brooding about the mystery woman for the next few weeks. And it even has a climax of a sort, when Ryabovich decides not to go back to the country house at the end. But the genius of the story is that it suggests a potential conflict and then refuses to resolve it, at least in the way the reader was expecting. Chekhov sets up a couple of binary questions. Who kissed Ryabovich, and will he ever find her again? And then, technically, Chekhov answers at least half of the question. No, Ryabovich won't find the girl. In fact, he won't even really look for her. That disappointment the reader feels at this turn of events is the point of the story. The real question is not whether Ryabovich gets the girl, but whether he can rise above his own timid nature. And that is a much more profound and unsettling question. To put it another way, Chekhov has performed a bait and switch on the unsuspecting reader. He starts with what looks like a sweet little love story and gives us instead a shattering and heartbreaking judgment of the main character. So even though nothing happens in the traditional sense, something profound does change over the course of the story, not in the character or in the situation, but in the reader. The first time I read The Kiss, at the age of 19 or 20, I approached the end of it with the expectation that it was going to resolve one way or the other. I expected that Ryabovich was going to be either happy or heartbroken at the end. But what I didn't see coming was that he's going to be just the same as he was in the beginning. I felt as if an abyss had opened at my feet as I realized that, yes, you can ruin your own life without even knowing that you're doing it. But I also felt exhilaration at the audacity and the tenderness of the story. Chekhov gives us an intimate and tragic portrait of a man who is presented with a vision of passion and does nothing about it. He does not find love, and he does not understand himself any better. And yet, even if nothing changed in Ryabovich, the story changed me profoundly. And that's what makes it a great story. I had a very similar feeling later that same semester, in the same class, when I read James Joyce's story, The Dead, for the first time. The Dead is the final story in Joyce's only volume of short fiction. Titled Dubliners, this volume of stories has been as influential for modern short story writers as Chekhov's short fiction, if not more so. Instead of a conventional climax or resolution, the stories in Dubliners rely upon what Joyce called an epiphany. This word comes from the ancient Greek word epiphaneia, which means an appearance or manifestation. In religious terms, the word epiphany means a deep spiritual insight or realization which has been brought about by divine intervention. Joyce used it to refer to an individual experiencing a moment of profound and sometimes life-changing self-understanding. The Dead is the longest story in Dubliners, about 60 pages long. And like The Kiss, it reads very conventionally, a steadily chronological account of a party in Dublin in the first week of January 1904. It is full of evocative details, sharply observed characters, and gentle humor. Most of the story is told from the point of view of a middle-aged man named Gabriel Conroy. Gabriel is the sort of successful and reliable fellow who is relied upon to carve the goose at the party and deliver a slightly pompous after-dinner speech. Near the end of the party, Gabriel witnesses his wife, Greta, listening raptly to a singer performing an old Irish folk song. Then, in the cab to the hotel room that they booked for the night, Gabriel is possessed of a powerful lust for his wife. His emotions have been stirred up by the happiness of the party and by the fact that they have a night to themselves without their children. But when they're alone in the room, Gabriel realizes that Greta is upset. She tells him that hearing the folk song at the party has reminded her of a boy named Michael Fury, who had loved her when she was a young woman. Fury used to sing that same song to her years ago, and he probably died because he stood in the rain waiting outside her window. Gabriel realizes that to make love to his wife at this moment would be akin to an assault, so after she falls asleep, he simply lies awake in the dark next to her. Gabriel's epiphany is his realization that Greta has never loved him as much as she loved the boy who died for her years ago. He further realizes that he has never loved her, or anyone else for that matter, the way that Michael Fury did. But instead of feeling rage or disappointment, Gabriel experiences a moment of expansive generosity for his wife, for himself, for Michael Fury, and in Joyce's famous phrase, for all the living and the dead. This is one of the most glorious moments in all literature. It knocked me flat when I first read it back in college, and it has knocked me flat every time I've read the story since, even though I know it's coming. Looking at the story as a whole, you might think that Joyce could have evoked Gabriel's epiphany in a shorter story, one that focused only on the aftermath of the party, but that simply wouldn't have worked. The first 40 pages of the story are a chronological and very entertaining account of the events at the party, and those scenes are structurally essential to what Joyce is trying to do. In those first 40 pages, Joyce shows us how a long-married couple present themselves to their friends and acquaintances in a public setting, and he includes details about Gabriel that only pay off at the end. This makes their moment of unexpected intimacy at the end even more poignant and piercing. In other words, you need to see as vividly as possible, and at considerable length, the life that Gabriel thought he was living in order to understand his shock when he realizes that nothing he ever thought about his life was true. At first glance, the structure of The Dead is similar to that of The Kiss. Both are chronological, both are centered around a party, both are essentially a series of evocative scenes that do not really make up a conventional plot. The final effect of The Dead, however, is different from that of The Kiss, because Gabriel comes to a new understanding of himself, and Ryabovich does not. Think back to the distinction E.M. Forster made between a story and a plot, that the story tells us what happened, but a plot tells us why. Now think back to how a conventional plot does this, by posing a question in the form of a conflict, and then answering the question by resolving the conflict. The structural brilliance of The Dead is that it does not set up a conflict at the start of the story. Instead, it holds your interest by giving you a plotless but entertaining and exquisitely detailed account of its main character and his social situation. Then it blindsides you at the end with a conflict that neither you nor the main character even knew existed. The conclusion of The Dead is powerful partly because of what it says, that happiness is precarious and sometimes it's founded on a lie. But it's also powerful because of the way that Joyce plays with your expectations. If he had set up a conventional plot, opening the story with Gabriel wondering if Greta was happy in their marriage, for example, the ending simply wouldn't have worked. The power of the story comes from the way it gives us what looks like an ordinary situation for its main character, and then surprises both Gabriel and the reader with something extraordinary. Pardon my bad pun, but a conventional plot would have killed The Dead. The use of everyday moments to build a picture of a world at a particular moment in order to reveal something profound also lies behind Virginia Woolf's great novel, Mrs. Dalloway. This book is set over a single day in London in the early 1920s, and it focuses on a well-to-do 52-year-old woman named Clarissa Dalloway as she prepares for a party at her home that evening. There are a couple other major characters as well. Peter Walsh, a former suitor of Clarissa's who has just returned from 5 years' service in India, and Septimus Warren Smith, a veteran of World War I who was suffering what used to be called shell shock and what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Other characters include Septimus Smith's Italian wife Rizia, Mrs. Dalloway's husband Richard, and her daughter Elizabeth, as well as a woman named Sally Seton, with whom Mrs. Dalloway was in love when they were both young women. There are only a few conventionally dramatic moments in Mrs. Dalloway. These include the suicide of Septimus Smith and the meeting of Clarissa and Peter Walsh after many years. They also include Clarissa's flashback of the moment when Sally Seton kissed her, and Peter's flashback to the moment when Clarissa rejected his proposal of marriage, both of which happened 30 years before. Otherwise, most of the incidents in the book are pretty ordinary. Except for the death of Septimus, of course, it's a pretty unremarkable day. So given that there's no conflict as such, no climax, and nothing to resolve at the end, what gives the book its structure? What gives it profluence? What changes over the course of Mrs. Dalloway? Instead of using a plot to structure the novel, Woolf uses two techniques. One of them governs the overall shape of the novel. The other governs its movement from scene to scene and from moment to moment within each scene. The overall shape is determined by the fact that the novel is set over the course of one day. This allows Woolf to limit the number of incidents in the book and to limit the scope of the characters. There's only so much the characters can do and only so far they can go in a single day. And taking into account Clarissa and Peter's flashbacks to their youth, there's only so much of their past that they can remember in a day. One way to structure the formless chaos of an entire life in a narrative would be to select the most important or dramatic events and string them together in a plot, the way Hollywood biopics often do. Instead, Virginia Woolf picks one day and writes about the most important events, actions, meetings, and memories of that day. The intention is that these events are representative enough to give us a vivid impression of the character's whole life. The technique of setting a novel or story in a single day is fairly common. A few years earlier, James Joyce had used the same technique on a much larger scale in his novel Ulysses. Over the years, the technique has also been used by such writers as Eva Figgis in her short but very beautiful novel Light, which is about a day in the life of the family of the painter Claude Monet, by Malcolm Lowry in Under the Volcano, which is about a day in the life of an alcoholic Englishman living in Mexico, and by yours truly in my novel Next. And there are also more conventionally plotted novels that take place in one day. There are lots of thrillers in which the hero is working against the clock, and it's easy to imagine an historical novel about the day Lincoln was assassinated, for example. What's important to note about Mrs. Dalloway, however, is that it's not a particularly significant day in the life of any of the characters, except for Septimus, of course. Instead, the idea behind it is that by very closely observing the thoughts of a few characters over a limited period of time, you can evoke a particular period and a way of life, the way you might infer the ocean from a drop of water. In my first lecture about plot, I talked about the lesson I learned from my high school English teacher, when she said that fiction imposes order on the chaos of reality. What we learn from the example of Mrs. Dalloway and other novels that take place in one day is that the order you impose doesn't necessarily need to be a conventional plot. You don't have to arrange the story's events in the usual way to have them mean something. The order you impose on reality can be as simple as focusing on the important details of a particular time period. The illumination of character or the evocation of a particular way of life in this way can be as satisfying as an old-fashioned plot. But even if you limit the events of your narrative to a single day, how do you make the narrative move forward if there's no conflict to be resolved? This brings us to the second method that Virginia Woolf uses in Mrs. Dalloway, the one that makes the novel flow from scene to scene and moment to moment. This is accomplished by Woolf's use of the stream of consciousness technique. In one of my lectures about character, I quoted a scene from the book that let us hear what Clarissa Dalloway was thinking as she looked in a shop window. As you may recall, the passage shifted very quickly from the sights and sounds of the world around Clarissa to memories of her girlhood, to the last days of her uncle, to her relationship with her daughter. Each brief moment in that passage tells us something about Clarissa Dalloway and her world that we didn't know before. What sort of girl she was, what sort of person her uncle was, what sort of relationship she has with her daughter. Using Gardner's term, this passage is profluent, even without Clarissa having to confront or resolve a conflict. The book devotes this kind of attention not just to Clarissa, but also to Peter Walsh, to her husband Richard, to Septimus Smith, and to Smith's wife Ritzia. Not all of these scenes are written in the same dense style Woolf uses to evoke Clarissa Dalloway's consciousness. A long central passage from the point of view of Peter Walsh is written in a more conventional expository style, while the passages from the point of view of Septimus Smith are feverish and full of violent imagery that evokes his spiritual agony. In fact, perhaps the most remarkable and influential feature of Mrs. Dalloway is the way Woolf effortlessly shifts the narrative's point of view from one character to another. These narrative shifts are what provide the momentum that other, more conventional books rely on plot to provide. There are long passages of Mrs. Dalloway where the point of view is limited to one character or bounces back and forth between two characters. But there are also several bravura sequences where the point of view shifts from one character to someone he or she has just passed in the street, and then on to another person, and so on. For example, only a few pages into the book, Clarissa hears an automobile backfire in the street while she's in a shop, and at that moment, the point of view quickly shifts from Clarissa to Septimus, who sees the same car. Then it shifts to Ritzia, then back to Clarissa, then to a woman selling flowers on the street, then to a couple of women and an old man outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, then back to Septimus and Ritzia, then to a girl named Maisie Johnson who asks Ritzia for directions, then to an old woman feeding the pigeons, and finally to a man standing on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. Over the course of 15 pages, some of these characters get a couple of pages each, while others are inhabited by Woolf for only a few sentences. It's a breathtaking piece of prose that requires more concentration from the reader than just following a plot. But if you stick with it, You end up with a more vivid evocation of a particular moment in the lives of these particular characters than you would have gotten from a more conventional narrative. So far, we've seen several different ways to structure a piece of fiction that don't rely on a plot. In Chekhov's The Kiss and Joyce's The Dead, the narrative uses a single moment to illuminate the rest of a character's life. While in Mrs. Dalloway, a chronology limited to a single ordinary day and a close attention to each character's most intimate thoughts evoke each character's entire life and a particular moment in history. Obviously, this sort of technique is not for everybody, and maybe not even for most writers. For all the difficulties we writers have with plot, and particularly with making a plot seem lifelike and not really like a plot, most of us fall back on it because, frankly, it's easier to do, and it's what most readers expect. An epiphany narrative like The Dead, or a plotless evocation of a single day like Mrs. Dalloway, require more effort and concentration from a reader than, say, the relentless, addictive, one damn thing after another forward momentum of a popular novel like Game of Thrones. Lots of readers don't see the point to a story like The Kiss, or they tried to read Ulysses or Mrs. Dalloway only because guys like me tell them they ought to, and then they give up after 25 pages. There's nothing wrong with that. I know lots of intelligent, sophisticated readers who have no patience for Mrs. Dalloway. But I will say this. If you're willing to make the extra effort, Mrs. Dalloway reaches places in a reader that a conventionally plotted novel, even a great one, simply cannot. And more to the point, trying to write a story or a book with an unconventional technique can make you a better writer. It can make you more observant, more subtle, and more engaged, even if all you plan to do is apply what you've learned to a more conventional narrative. 4 of the 5 books I've written so far are conventionally plotted. But my 5th book, Next, was my attempt to apply the technique of Mrs. Dalloway to a different sort of life, only with more jokes. I'd like to think it's my best book, but even if it isn't, it made me dig deeper as a writer than I ever have before. As a matter of fact, the type of fiction I've been talking about in this lecture isn't even considered all that radical anymore. You'll notice that the 3 examples I've cited so far, The Kiss, The Dead, and Mrs. Dalloway, all date from the late 19th or early 20th century. And since then, another, even more adventurous literary technique has grown up, known as postmodernism. This is a huge topic which takes us beyond the scope of these lectures, and indeed beyond my own area of expertise. So without getting into the whole history of prose fiction since World War II, suffice it to say that a postmodern novel is one that plays games with language and with the usual narrative conventions of plot and character, and which consistently calls the reader's attention to the fact that he or she is reading a work of fiction. One of the hallmarks of postmodern writers is that they love jokes and puns, and they often like to play with structure. For example, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest includes 388 footnotes that appear at the end of the book. Roger Boylan's novel, Kill Oil, includes footnotes on the same page as the text. These notes are often addressed directly to the reader and provide a sort of cranky and very funny commentary on the rest of the book. Even if you have no interest in creating this kind of fiction yourself, these books and stories are worth looking at because, over the past 40 or 50 years, many of the techniques of postmodernism have made their way into the mainstream. Take, for example, Jennifer Egan's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad. This is a novel in stories about a group of people who revolve around a rock and roll producer named Benny Salazar. Written in very accessible literary prose, the individual stories and the novel as a whole are humane and moving in a conventionally satisfactory way. But at the same time, Egan very cleverly uses a lot of techniques from the postmodernist toolbox. She arranges the stories out of chronological order. She tells one story in the second person, and most famously, she tells one of the stories in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. It's the best of both worlds, incorporating postmodern techniques in a very entertaining way, but delivering all the emotional satisfaction of a mainstream novel. An even more adventurous combination of experimental literary technique and old-fashioned storytelling is the British writer Kate Atkinson's Life After Life. In this remarkable novel, the main character, Ursula Todd, lives her life over and over again, with each parallel life playing out differently than all the others. Ursula dies at the end of each chapter, and then her life begins again in the next chapter with her birth in England in 1910. Several of the early chapters are very short, as Ursula dies in childbirth, or as an infant, or as a young girl. She goes on to die several times during the influenza epidemic of 1918. She is also killed by an abusive husband, and in one chapter, she dies during the Blitz in World War II. As the novel goes on, however, each of her lives is longer and more satisfying, almost as if Ursula is learning from each iteration of her existence. Like A Visit from the Goon Squad, Life After Life is written in an accessible literary style. The characters that recur throughout the novel, Ursula's parents, siblings, friends, and lovers, remain more or less the same in each life, even as Ursula's relationship with them changes from version to version. But the overall structure not only suggests that each of our lives is a series of accidents or coincidences over which we have little control, it also raises interesting questions about the nature of literary character. Namely, how many changes can Atkinson make in Ursula and still have her be the same person? More importantly, the novel tests the very foundations of storytelling, which is what makes it postmodern. In most narratives, when the writer makes a choice about a moment in the plot, she closes off all the other possible plot lines. But in Life After Life, Atkinson deliberately works against that idea of closure. She can't show us all of Ursula's possible lives. That would take an infinitely long book. But she can suggest infinity by showing us a wide variety of them. Like A Visit from the Goon Squad, it's a remarkable and very satisfying combination of vivid storytelling and postmodern playfulness. If you think you might like to try some of the techniques I've talked about in this lecture, here's an exercise. Take a single character and write about an hour in that person's life, limiting yourself to 5 pages. Do not pick the hour when something significant happened to the character, when he killed somebody or fell in love, for example. Instead, pick one of the countless hours in a person's life where nothing particularly important is going on. But do try to put in as much detail about that person as you can, including memories or flashbacks which might be provoked by something as simple as a smell or an overheard comment. By limiting the time period and the number of pages, you provide yourself with a structure that doesn't rely on plot. But if you put a lot of detail in, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how much you can get across about the character. You may even get more than 5 pages out of it. Whether you want to tell a good old-fashioned story with a beginning, middle, and an end, or a crazy, ambitious postmodernist epic, the point is to engage the heart and mind of the reader and keep her turning the pages. And perhaps the most daunting part of creating a plot or a structure is knowing how and where to begin. In my next lecture, I'll talk about some strategies for getting started, using examples from William Faulkner, Mark Twain, and Marilynne Robinson.